So I think when people talk about Zoom fatigue, they're talking mostly about cognitive, sometimes emotional exhaustion. And it does have a lot to do with what you're describing about the energy that's required for interpretation and how much we as humans rely on proxemics, rely on gestures.
Proxemics. Is
Yeah.
that a communication term?
So, yeah,
I like it.
how much are we in proximity to each other,
Right.
what it means to lean forward, to lean back. Often, if you think about your typical Zoom meeting and the advice that I give to people as we talk about what we know from Zoom fatigue is like you want to move back further from the screen because we have a tendency to get it to be
Right.
like this, almost like a Brady Bunch type of series of faces. But then
Do your
often,
students know who the Brady Bunch is?
no, they would not. They don't even, when you make the Ferris Bueller jokes, they don't know those yet either.
Bueller.
Yeah.
Bueller.
There's a whole other conversation about how there's not even common jokes now because of media fragmentation, but that's fine.
Oh, yeah.
Going back to Zoom fatigue. Okay.
Yep. Zoom fatigue.
So gestures are not typically visible in a Zoom window. So one thing that you can do to add that back in and help to make sure you are understood better and to aid people in less Zoom fatigue is to move backwards so you can gesture and more of your body is in the frame. The inevitable lag, regardless of how fast your internet connection is, that's throwing off our brain as we're interpreting things. There's an element of, as you and I talk to each other, we're not doing a lot of direct eye contact the entire time. Humans tend to, as they're collecting their thoughts, look through other directions, and then at the end, look at the person that they're talking to. On Zoom, as we're all looking at our screen, which is where our camera tends to be, our brain registers almost as like hostility, a continued
or like
staring or looking
10
forward.
people are staring at me.
The same, yeah. So
And they all have a resting bitch face and they look like they're annoyed.
yes.
What did I do?
That's not very, like our brain doesn't process that very well, even if we understand now that it's the norm. And the other element is most people have the self view up when they're doing a Zoom meeting. And that is also fatiguing for us because we're attending to how are we coming across? What do we look like? And so when you add all those elements together, you're going to be far more tired after an hour-long Zoom conversation than you would be sitting at a conference table with those same number of people.
That's fascinating, and it makes total sense. I'm Todd Pringle, and this is the Crosswinds Institute podcast. My guest is Carrie Platt, professor of communication at North Dakota State University. Dr. Platt researches how communication technology impacts our work, our relationships, and even our sense of self. From Zoom fatigue to the growing mental health crisis, we discuss how social change is driven by technology and media. This is especially important with the explosion of social media in our culture. Whether we like it or not, we are all in the media game now.
Only the beginning.
Ready?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Hi, Carrie Ann.
Hi.
How are you today?
I'm awesome. Thank
All right.
you.
Thank
How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you for doing this. I guess, hopefully, as always, if I remember, disclaimer, the views expressed by the host or the guests are our own and not necessarily representative of our organization. So we're just going to have a conversation here. Maybe to some perspective of why I think this is a important conversation. It seems that we really need to understand media, we being everybody, needs to understand media in a more sophisticated way than we do. And we need to understand how it pervades our lives. And most importantly, if anything comes out of this conversation, it would be the recognition that we're all actually participating in it in ways that we don't appreciate. That in many ways everybody's in the media game now. So I mean, every time you hit like on a post or put a picture on Instagram or reply to something on Facebook or put those humble brags on LinkedIn. So honored to have been asked to speak at a panel for a lunch event. All of those things are, active participation in media and what we call social media. How that entanglement actually drives change, how that drives social change, how our culture is in many ways a product of our media. But I'm hopeful in this conversation we can shine a more detailed light on that so that people can make better decisions and know that their use of media and their engagement and participation in media is actually changing the narratives that either bind us or rip us apart. And so maybe we can start with that. What is the field of communication and how broad it is? and then maybe contextualize that with where your research is right now in the field.
Yeah. So I think using the term broad to describe the field of communication is very apt because there are so many individual subfields and so many connections to different disciplines. Communication started out bridging out of the humanities. So if you think about the study of literature, poetry, et cetera, moving to study that in oral speech, right? Having people who are studying like poetic forms of expression, metaphors. Why was one person a far more effective public speaker than another? That movement from things that were ideas in the humanities to applying them to human speech and then moving into applying that to human interaction. We see more social scientific methods coming in. I would say overall, communication as a field is really interested in how we interact with one another, how we create messages, whether that's me creating these words that I'm sharing with you today or someone creating a TikTok video, and also how people receive those messages. And so that can be effects, as you mentioned. What is the effect of being exposed to a particular type of content, using a particular piece of technology, or being, in a conversation with someone else and hearing a particular form of verbal aggression? How does that make us feel about the relationship, about that interaction? And so different subfields in communication divide out according to what are they studying, that social interaction piece. I have colleagues who are studying workplace interaction. I have someone in my department who looks at meeting facilitation and conflict. I have other folks who are studying public relations. How do organizations communicate with the public? I have scholars in my department who are like me, that they're studying technology, but they're most interested in how are we communicating with robots? How are we communicating with AI programs? It can range depending on what your area of research interest is in the field. And I would also add that there are people who are studying how you make these products that we're going to talk about today more effective, right? Folks who are studying advertising, mass media production, and others who say, okay, then what about the consumers, the users, the producers, as you're talking about what's going on with them?
So it seems like journalism degrees used to be a thing on a regular basis when every town had a newspaper. Now it seems like journalism degrees seem to be a little more specialized in terms of which colleges have them.
We have them at NDSU, a journalism degree in the department I teach in.
And then mass comm used to be, it seemed like, mass communications used to be a degree, or presumably still is a degree. But how old is the field? And, is journalism itself a subdomain in terms of journalism research, a subdomain of communication? But anyway, start with how old is...
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned the ancient Greeks, and when you first start being trained on the scholarly side of communication, usually you start with them. Aristotle, in particular, had a lot to say about the way in which we are able to persuade other people, the way
Persuasion
in which,
is,
communities can, through discussion, deliberation, come to understand things better and to make better decisions. So when you see that first movement out of what had previously been studies of literature, what would be considered part of the field, usually of English, into what is called speech communication, that's late 1800s, early 1900s. The movement toward the study of either mass communication, the use of more social science theories, corresponds most closely with World War II, because there was a greater interest from the government in being able to understand the impact of propaganda on large audience sizes, and so more funding available to do that type of research. And then the techniques which had been developed, a lot of it within psychology, some through sociology, were brought into the study of these messages and the impact of these messages on populations. And so at that time, I think when we think about journalism, as I understand it in the field, it's always been a split between studying the products, the media, the potential impact of that on an audience, and then training future journalists to work within the field. And so in an academic department like the one that I work in, you can have people who are doing research on journalism. I have a colleague who studies the history of journalism, and we're also training journalists at the same time. And so a lot of what we do is to try to imbue that education with a strong ethical grounding, because we know that the media in many forms can have a very powerful sway over how the public understands an issue. And so there is a responsibility to reporting in order to not necessarily push people in the direction that you're wanting them to to go, but as objectively as a human possibly can to make sure that people are as well informed as possible. So the shorter version is that the research on mass media informs the way that we train journalists today. But the training for a journalist in 2024 is very different than it would have been, I would say, even 5 years ago, certainly 10, 15 years ago.
How much effort is put into just trying to keep up with the whirlwind of the change by which news and information is being promulgated in the way it is changing things. And is it moving too fast to keep up, or?
I don't know that it's moving too fast. As I think about social media, we've had various forms of it for 15 to 20 years now. That aspect of news stories are no longer controlled by gatekeepers who are the folks who run the newspaper, right? The editor deciding what story is going to be selected for inclusion in the paper and shared, or with broadcast news, what's going to be shared on the nightly news. From, I would say, like 2008, 2010 forward, we have been contending with this idea that you talk about like citizen journalists, or really anyone who is actively participating and talking about news stories, recording something, sharing it out. We had YouTube. I think the speed at which things are now being produced, being shared, the ease with which you can create something that looks fairly professional or create something that is false but looks real, that element has definitely changed. But for at least the past 10 years, we have been operating, as we think about training journalists, right, or we think about studying the media, operating in an era where you have almost like a din of sound and reporting and voices in which you're trying to break through in a way, get people engaging with your content.
Right.
And so a lot of that
Explosion of
training,
content.
has been how can you incorporate some of the aspects that are really neat about social media and about people participating and being in conversation. I think the expectation, if you're becoming a journalist nowadays, that you would communicate regularly with your readers is far higher than it would have been when I was back in college. For instance, I got a degree in public relations and communication. I wasn't trained as a journalist. But now you're trained as a journalist, you have to have this wide array of skills. A lot of visual storytelling is a big in-demand skill now, and that is a reflection of this move toward, we think about Instagram, TikTok now, very image-based or video content. So where prior you might have been able to train as a print journalist because you wanted to go and write for the Fargo Forum, for instance, now you have to be kind of cross-training. You have to have the strong, solid writing skills, but you also may need to take photographs. You're going to take video. You're going to put it together. We talk about multimedia storytelling because that is the type of content that brings a more modern audience in and also that tends to get shared out. And you have to learn how to promote yourself and interact with others on social media. It's not so much sitting in an office by yourself writing copy that's then printed and distributed to an audience. But the generation that we're training now to be journalists have always had media that exists like that. They've always had the ability to kind of share their voice with others through social media. And I think they probably also have a higher than average tolerance for just how much content is out there. This idea of there's always going to be a din, you're always competing for views, likes, etc. That's been their entire adolescence to college age as they're training now.
I'm obviously older than that, and I've watched the change happen.
Sure.
But it seems to me that we're all in the media game now, with the exception of a few people who there are humans I know, non-elderly humans that don't have smartphones, but they're quite rare birds. But if we say that nearly everybody is in the media game now, and we know from even the 2016 election, we elected a populist, and that hadn't really happened since Jackson in the 1800s, and part of that was a Facebook phenomenon. And part of that was the interactive ads. It seems like and everybody tells a narrative of why somebody won. I mean, when the elections are this close, I mean, there's a million reasons why somebody won or lost, and we're just picking a couple exemplars, but it's relevant exemplars. And it was one of the things that Trump's victory was attributed to was ad adaptability on Facebook, but part and parcel to that was the level of engagement that the average person had to sort of get past the gatekept narrative. Because the major media, they thought Trump was great when he was essentially kicking ass through the Republican nomination because it was all the spectacle and to all this attention, and then all of a sudden, oh wait, he's the nominee, and we saw a lot of sort of weaponized establishment trying to stop that. But that and maybe in an election without social media, that would have been successful. But the fact that we were in the social media age and the fact that we had nearly everybody actively participating in media, we resulted in a major outcome that had major implications. And I'm setting aside any conversation about whether those are good or bad things. It's really polarizing stuff, and it's not the point I'm trying to make. Point I'm trying to make is it's highly impactful, and nobody did that on purpose. That was replying, that was posting memes on Facebook during that, or responding to an ad. And that's the normal we are today, and that was 2016. And now it's ramified much more. And I think about comms education, and I think about if you're not a comms major, you get what, Comm 110?
Public speaking.
Public speaking, which is good. People should know this. But you're going to get your degree in something else, and you're not going to be educated in the understanding that, do you know that you're in the media game? Do you know that at some level you're a citizen journalist, not necessarily in a way that one normally thinks of that, but you're helping with the story. You're interacting with the emerging of the stories.
So what I hear you saying is that my gen ed course that I teach media and social change should be the required one for everyone to take.
I would, like if I could wave a magic wand right now, and I think about like, this is an interesting conversation, and I like squirrels. Okay. Do we really need to be teaching public education what am I saying? Do we really need to be teaching public speaking to a generation that's had thousands of hours of a camera on themselves, interacting with friends and everything else, that have self-curated their own look? And I mean, how many girls don't like put their one leg in front of the other and do the slight turn to create the hourglass? And that's even promulgated all the way up the ages now. Everybody having a self-awareness of a personal branded supermodel to some extent. I don't mean everybody's a supermodel, but I mean the cameras are ubiquitous, the recording is ubiquitous, the interaction with friends and seeing. I mean, we have every cohort now growing up that's zoomed through school for a year and a half.
But to play devil's advocate in regard to public speaking, and based on what I have heard from my students who are from a lot in the first year and second year of college, the ability to present oneself effectively in a face-to-face environment is diminished, and certainly has diminished over the past 5 years. And so students will tell me directly that they want opportunities to learn how better to interact or to come across in person, because that is far more challenging based on what you're describing.
Why do they teach it online?
Why do they teach public speaking online?
Yeah,
I don't know the answer to that question.
Because it's hard. I mean, you got to. Yeah. I'm creating problems for people with this.
But there's more than 3 credits required in general education. We could have multiple communication
courses. I think media and social change, or some kind of. It seems like this is information that is like, you're dangerous without this information. I mean, you're out there. It's like you're going to have your own newspaper and you have no journalism training.
Sure. I do think, though, that in high school, students get plenty of messaging regarding their digital footprint and its longevity, and thinking about what they're posting on social media.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And there's a generation before that that's petrified of somebody finding the things they posted when they were 14. Now a 14-year-old is, and both parents and the school and the kids seem to be more aware of, let's say, the liability and personal reputation issues associated with that.
But we're not talking as much about ways in which it can be beneficial,
but yet how your participation in the public squares and your creation of content, and even if you're not a content creator, you're affecting how much content is being boosted or not by even your subtlest interaction as slowing the scroll.
Yes. So
Not
the understanding of the algorithm.
Yeah.
Yep.
An understanding of how the algorithms are manipulating you and learning from you.
Yeah. And often pushing you toward more extreme forms of content that you first started looking at.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you don't have to be consciously passive to that. I mean, you're not passive to that is the problem. Is it's picking up on things as subtle as you simply slowed down to see the train wreck that was in your X feed, and now it thinks you want to see train wrecks. But you will be influenced by those things. An earlier interview we did with Dr. Ian McGilchrist was this notion that every day we generate the world. Every day in the choices we make, we are creating the world. I mean, the future is created by our actions every day, and we don't appreciate what anonymous vitriol. How potentially damaging that is to discourse, or a sort of a dominance hierarchy game on social media interactions where you're trying to, win the argument. It seems like we don't get that exactly how we engage these devices is directly creating our world we're living in. And we're living in a world right now that's deeply polarized, that can't have a conversation at a national level, that isn't combat for clicks, that's weaponized and monetized, and that the money has gotten so large, and the gatekeeping is coming back. The gatekeeping at like sort of who's on a platform and who can be on a platform. And all these things are happening in a background where we've lost trust in legacy media, whatever we want to call that. I'm kind of, I hope I'm not auguring into a word salad here, but it would seem that everybody should have some baseline of education around media to inform their interaction with it. And that's what I'm hoping we can maybe build a course outline for in this in this conversation.
Sounds great to me.
So maybe just a big generic thing to continue to set the table here. What is meant by the term the medium is the message? I mean, in how does that relate to this conversation?
Sure. So this is a phrase that is from Marshall McLuhan's 1964 book, if I'm recalling correctly. And it's interesting that you're asking about it because I feel that nowadays in communication research, it's almost assumed that that would be the case. But when he was first bringing forward this argument in the early to mid 1960s, it was somewhat groundbreaking because up to that point, we had been very preoccupied with what the content of a given sort of either television, broadcast, film, speech, pamphlet for propaganda, that the idea was what influenced people, what changed the way that people thought about something or how they felt about others was exclusively the words or the pictures that were being conveyed to them. And he pointed out a number of different ways in which the form, right, the nature of television as a medium, how it can prompt us to think about the world in particular ways because it is visual, not necessarily what the story, it could be a story reported about crime, it could be a story reported about local parks, and they could be using very similar imagery. And so you can end up with people being persuaded more by what it is that they're seeing and less by the words that they're hearing. The reason that I say that it's almost taken for granted now in the field is what you referenced previously, where you talk about TikTok, for instance, and the length of video content, especially algorithmically driven social media, that over time, we went from having these longer films to having shorter television shows, then watching shorter videos on YouTube, and now having fairly short video clips that we're working through at a random pace, whether you're watching them through like Instagram, watching them on TikTok. Often it's a generational difference that communication scholars who are interested in the impact of that content on consumers, on users, they are going to look a little bit at what's being represented there, but they'll also talk about, well, what's the impact on attention span? The most content is received through these sort of brief clips that we're seeing repeatedly, and we lose our ability or our tolerance to engage in long form. That is one reason why podcasts don't tend to go viral. They are something that are engaged with by listeners with greater depth, tends to go more in depth on issues, but aren't shared out in the same way that a TikTok clip would be, just
Right.
based on duration and depth.
But we'll have to make sure we say like brief seconds, 7-second bursts of highly insightful or entertaining things, so we
Yes.
can slice that into.
And you'll have to have the
into
right
our TikTok.
digital stickers on it and words on the screen. Yep.
Yeah,
It's a completely different media.
Yeah,
media form.
I don't know nearly enough about it, but there's AI tools now that you can take a long form podcast, and it knows when subjects have changed, and it will automatically slice it into the cuts for you.
Yep.
And can even like turn them into ready to launch reels. And all you have to do is look at them.
Because there's a sufficient convention in human language to know when subject changes are happening.
Yep. And so that means that just is a continuing combinatorial explosion of content now that everything can be broken up into all of its little slices. So attention spans is another part of the use of media and awareness of media and its effect on culture. It does seem like across the modern world, we are not. Can we even say we're no longer good at focusing? Because it really seems like, structurally speaking, we're almost never in a position where we're allowed to focus, which is kind of its own argument, because tech has reached us almost at all times. The instant messaging tech, that's any corporate world is going to have its email, and it's going to have its whether it's Teams or something else or Slack or its instant messaging tech, and then at the same time your phone's always got texts coming in, or whatever them young people do that they probably don't call text.
Snapchat.
Snaps. Well, Gen Z's. Did Gen Z snap? Isn't Gen Z's a millennial thing, or the Gen Z's are still snapping?
Yep, they are.
Okay. Keep their streaks going or whatever.
I mean, Snapchat as a platform has evolved considerably, and I think it's one of those things that it often makes it difficult to differentiate between, to say like, well, this is what Snapchat is for, and this is what TikTok is for, and this is what Instagram is for, because as they compete for the attention of users, they're morphing into one another.
Yeah, and that's the convergence. Where is there a convergence happening around, I don't know, 10 years from now, are we going to see that there's like 4 or something, main forms by which these things take, and pretty much every app attempts to make them available, because it seems like those things are happening, but without necessarily the settling into the deep basin of, okay, for sure this now form's going to stay, but everybody seems to be going into short reels.
Yes.
Almost every app seems to want to have some kind of messenger attached to it. Not every app is friendly with like long video, and that might be just sort of the cost of cloud space associated if everybody can suddenly put 2 hours.
It's also a recognition of what audiences are willing to watch, how long they'll watch content.
But X has added, X seems to be going right for YouTube in adding its long form, but Musk does what Musk does.
Well, it's also connected to the monetization. There's a slight lengthening now going on with TikTok videos, because you can get more ad revenue generated if you can demonstrate that the eyeballs have been following your content for a longer amount of time.
Yeah.
And so you'll see interesting kind of genre conventions that are almost borrowed from like the ages of radio, right? Like cliffhangers that people build into, making
I've
their
heard of that.
their
Yeah,
TikTok video
I've
a little
seen
bit
bits and
longer
pieces
to
of
get
those
you to
dramas.
keep you
Yeah.
keep watching. And as you can say, like I've kept my viewers over the 4-minute mark,
Yep.
you're going to end up with more
Yep.
ad revenue.
Yep. And it's all this is happening to us, by us. But
Yeah. And then we use the function that speeds up the video to like twice this 1.5 speed, twice the speed. I also know students, and I do this myself. If I am reviewing a meeting that was conducted via Zoom, I couldn't be there, I got the recording. It's hard for me to sit and listen to it in real time
no,
speed.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I can't, unless it's math, or something, really dense with a lot of layers of abstraction that you're still kind of trying to figure out each
Right.
one. But if it's just words speaking, who's ever listening or watching this right now
Sure.
is probably finding that I'm talking very slow. But yeah, I 2x or more almost everything that's not dense.
And this is one of the challenges of teaching people to be good listeners in face-to-face conversation, that we know the human mind moves faster than people can speak or convey information to us. And it takes a lot of focus and a lot of patience and a lot of practice to really sit and genuinely listen to someone with that level of patience when we live in a world where we can speed it up to 1.5 or 2.
I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation with somebody, and in my mind, I've like reached for the dial, like the button to, like, I can't. But it's like right now, I'm trying to be very intentional about what I'm saying, and I'm attempting to be as coherent as possible, and that slows it down even more. And then you throw a metacognitive loop of I'm also listening to myself, and it's even more. But we can fix that in post. So,
Sure.
We'll just speed everything up. Attention spans, with all the stimuli and all this optimization and getting into these weird world, where we seem to be able to convey, implicit or explicit messages in mere seconds now, because whichever one that you see that's got some interesting mimetic kind of thing on TikTok, what you're not seeing is, I don't know, the 2 million other ones that didn't get traction.
Sure.
So as a, from a generative or a genetic algorithm standpoint, everything's being tried all at once, because everybody's using it, and everybody, lots and lots of people trying to create content, and what comes out are the things that somehow capture the ability to communicate in a denser and denser format. Whether that is a thing you can actually say what's being communicated, or it's just sort of a sense, because there's a whole lot of, especially with the visual, and then you throw the interesting things that are all happening with music and these certain types of songs, like oh no, I'm sure I butchered that, but and then the layers, because you have people that are learning this sort of meme culture, that you can echo with. It's just amazing. I worry though that we're going to get to a point where nobody can sit. I struggled to listen in classrooms all the way through undergrad, and part of it was I couldn't speed people up, and part of it is just me. But what happens to education when that's, I don't know, 70% of the students feel that 50 minutes is like 10 times or 100 times longer than they want to think about something. And in that 50 minutes, they've been on their multiple apps, whether on their laptop or their phone.
Sure.
Is the field of communication within that literature, is attention spans and effect on attention spans, part of that literature, or is that psychology, or is it joint efforts? What do we know about this right now?
I think it would be likely heavier studied in psychology. There may be some joint efforts. I think a lot of the most exciting research these days is interdisciplinary teams where people can draw from, you have a computer scientist, you have a communication scholar, you have someone who is doing research within psychology and can work together. A lot of the, I think, content in regard to attention span may be more on the training side of how do you adapt to consumers that have a shorter attention span or have certain expectations when it comes to what they would pay attention to. Focus groups came into communication through advertising research, right? When people would figure out,
Right.
well, do they want to hear this about the detergent brand or do they want to hear that about the detergent brand? So some of what we know may be focused more on that production angle. I think when we talk about, like, we hear of studies that say like the average undergraduate's attention span is now like this many seconds long. I don't even know how you would document that or determine that through research. I think that these are headlines that gain a lot of traction
Right.
because we as a society have great fears regarding what media is doing with us and to us. As someone who has read quite a bit of like history on media, this has happened the whole way, right? Like there were fears that books would destroy our ability to remember anything because we didn't have to carry around the knowledge
That
or
is
the
true.
epic
Yeah.
poetry
Yep,
in
yep,
our
yep.
head.
Yep.
Fears that comic books would destroy a whole generation of children because it wasn't the
Yes.
quality
Yep. Remember
content
that.
of, I can remember, and you may as well, like fears of what television would do to children who were growing up watching it.
And games.
Yes. And so I do think that there are very legitimate concerns regarding heavy usage and particular types of usage with social media, because in many ways, that algorithm that you've talked about makes it a more formidable foe when you're trying to control your own usage. Like television is very, I have a 9-year-old, I have an 11-year-old. They love television, but there is something about it, like an Instagram feed, where it
Right.
just keeps feeding
Yep.
content and it keeps, as you said,
And
learning
the
what it is they're
intermittent dopamine,
interested.
the intermittent reward.
Yeah.
Maximize dopamine of
Yeah.
intermittent reward.
And so then, even though I am someone who, when I'm teaching undergraduates, I talk about how do you develop intentional technology use? How do you develop an ability to maximize technology use in line with your values and control technology use that you feel is at odds with things that you value? I think for an 18 to 20-year-old whose brain is still developing, right? They don't have the whole prefrontal cortex going yet, that it's hard for them. It's almost nearly impossible for my 9 and 11-year-old to cut themselves off, right, from the Instagram feed, because it almost feels as if it's connecting to their brainstem. It's giving them the content that they find very
Right.
engrossing, and it is an infinity pool. You can keep scrolling
Yep.
and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And so if it's like a 9 and 11-year-old up against a company like Meta and their use of AI and algorithms to keep people coming back
Right.
to the content, I mean, that fight isn't fair. And so I just want to be clear that even though there have been past eras where we've really worried about the impact of media and particularly worried about it on children, adolescents, young adults, I think that it's a little bit different now. I do think that the concerns are warranted because the technology makes it so difficult to do like disconnect, right? And go and do other things that we know are beneficial for children, for adolescents, things that I talk about my college students with, that in the fields of communication, one of the things that we talk about is that it may not necessarily be the content you're exposed to or even the form, right? That medium is the message part, but it's the displacement of what you're not doing because so much time all of the sudden is spent engaging with social media. I survey my students when I teach the class about the amount of time that they're spending on social media. And I would say some of them say, I don't do, for various reasons, I avoid social media because I'm trying to make other things in my life more of a priority. I have some students who say 7 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
They're spending 7 hours a day on social media. And so that's 7 hours that they're not doing other things, such as face-to-face interactions with friends.
Do we know 30 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
So I remember the conversations, television's rotting your brain.
Yeah. And don't what I love is we always heard, don't get too close to the TV because it will like destroy your vision.
Yeah.
And now we have like Oculus.
Yeah.
Puts it a few inches away.
Everybody, then you've got the hunch over.
Yeah. Text neck.
But I mean, remember that the television's going to rot your brain, and it would seem to me that 30 years ago, which is about when the internet became ubiquitous, so just a little bit before that, there would have been distributions. I'm not saying they're the same shape, but you'd have people who barely watch television, and you'd have people that watch 6, 7, 8 hours a day of television as a fairly passive consumer of information.
Or just had it on in the background nearly constantly.
I mean, I watched piles of television growing up.
And you turned out all right?
That's debatable.
Okay.
But that's what we're talking about. What's this going to do, and to what extent is overconsumption of television really the same as overconsumption of a feed, and what potentially is it really different, and do we have any idea? I mean, so you mentioned books, and yeah, the idea that books are going to ruin memory, and to some extent, they likely did hurt a bit. To what extent people invested the effort to have things memorized, just like we used to. Our relationship to maps, and remembering how to get there, and learning the ways to get there. We don't have to do that anymore. It's not clear, like what's the consequences of that writ large across society. But if you actually just look at print as a media, and you look at Gutenberg and the Gutenberg Revolution, the effect of being able to produce books and or pamphlets, the ability to produce the written text massively and cheaply, to the current world order that existed at the time, it was absolutely devastating. It just took a long time to play out. I mean, it's hard to envision the Reformation without Gutenberg. It's hard to envision, essentially the half of Europe, roughly, sort of deposing the Pope and saying, screw you guys. We've got the book now, and what you've been saying is different than what we're seeing. And you have the Reformation and the Protestant movement. It's hard to envision that happening without the change in media, and it's hard to envision the Enlightenment, whether it's Reformation or the Enlightenment or the Scientific Revolution, or the Industrial Revolution, or the Information Revolution. All of that seems to stem from the amount of information that was available to the average person, and how much for what cost, literally resource costs, which would also include time,
right?
And the ability of any one individual, elite or otherwise, to be able to spread information. It seems that that's been exploding, and at the same time, what's been exploding in the world is all of this rapid social change. And while the Gutenberg press had decades and centuries, it's essentially the story of that moment, that technology and what its impacts are, is more than is a 500 plus year story that we're now just being able to tell now, because these things took a lot of time. But you pick your exemplars here of how awesome the world is. I mean, I like a lot of things about our world, and I'm an engineer. I love technology, and I love water we can drink, and all these other things. But at the same time, as in the great conversation we had with Ian McGilchrist, we talked about this a lot, which is how we also have deconstructed all of our narratives, and the postmodern movement and the complete shredding of meta narratives, and getting into this hyper polarized, highly ramified world where nobody really can agree anymore on things. While I'm not sitting here saying, we need to go back to 18 whatever and say we all need to agree to those stories, it doesn't seem like that will work. But the net effect of this change in media is a huge driver of maybe the crisis of meeting and fentanyl addiction and suicide. Because one of the things that's happened is everybody can tell their story, and now we know one of the things is we don't have a shared story. Okay, so now we have social media, and we're about to put generative AI into that mix, and the scale, the time scale, is sped up by literally orders of magnitude from Gutenberg.
So we're having to make decisions without knowing fully what
Exactly.
the impact are.
Scary. And at least can we as a people at least see that. At least see that we have created this communication tech and cultural construct, and it's just insanely powerful, on steroid, orders of magnitude stronger than now we can print books. And we're about to put sophisticated large language models and other generative AI into there to help make content, and the arbiter of good content is going to be who can make money off of it, which is going to be who can get our attention, that will then hopefully indirectly get us to buy stuff. So that doesn't seem like that default. If that's going to be the control mechanism, that's going to be the thing that's going to drive the evolution of this stuff, that seems dangerous and dumb. And so can we at least recognize the predicament that we're in, and understand that means that when you're sitting down to scroll, what you do affects the world we live in and the world your kids live in. I mean, it is. There's few things I think are more important than getting some sort of conscious, intentional control together over our narratives.
Yes. And I think it's challenging in that much of social media culture is built on the cultivation of almost like a personal brand, right? It's individual expression. It's amplifying that tendency, which is already fairly dominant within American culture, certainly, that this is a space for you to share what you want to share, and whether that's highlighting certain features in order to come across a particular way, or whether that's this idea of I'm going to be authentic. I don't care what others think. I want to share what it is that I have to say, that I think about this particular issue. I'm just going to put it all out there. Authenticity is my brand.
Right. Yep.
I think it's hard to cultivate concern for what do these behaviors do to the experience, the information, the perceptions of others, when the entire ecosystem has been built on this idea of it's for self-expression and a customization of content to things that are personally interesting or relevant to me. That's why the algorithm is viewed as helpful by a lot of people, because they don't want to have to sift through content that doesn't align with their interests. They would prefer it to be delivered to them based on what they've seen before. I can remember when I first started teaching and talking about targeted advertising, that I would hear from students, they wouldn't understand why that was a problem. They thought it was very helpful that they would, that the company, Facebook at that point, would be using information on their past browsing history, what they had interacted with, even other places on the web, in order to show them tailored ads. They thought that was great. The price of data privacy wasn't something that they were necessarily concerned about. I do feel that Generation Z is different in this respect. I think they are having more conversations about data privacy, talking about it more, caring about it a little bit more. I don't know if they're necessarily taking the time to go through that long menu and click off the cookies that are third-party cookies and following them around the web. But Gen Z does seem to be more attuned to the price that we're paying to have technology be the way that it is than the millennial generation. And I'm an elder millennial, and I have taught many millennials, and so I have noticed.
As a Gen Xer, I find the term elder millennial to be oxymoronic, but I'll take it.
Yeah, right. And I have two younger siblings, and so I think a lot of your generational identity can be what was the family context. And my parents owned Radio Shack stores, so
awesome.
I was on the internet a few years earlier than anyone in my peer group, which makes me more millennial than the friends that I would have who would be Gen X.
That's.
But cool. I say that as like a measure of hope for the
Yeah.
future. The question is, there can be the recognition of like, what is the cost that we're paying, and whether that cost is data privacy, whether that cost is our connections to one another. I know a big thing now is how you can use technology to reduce the amount of face-to-face interaction you have to have with other humans. So whether that's a self-checkout, whether that's being able to order Starbucks on the app so you can just walk in and grab it and not have to interact with a barista, that convenience that we're getting at the cost often of our face-to-face interacting and communication skills. I see the recognition amongst my Gen Z students, but there is anxiety about trying to switch it in the other direction. That may also be the pandemic. Students who report that they feel like when they were at home, when they were doing Zoom-based school, that these face-to-face communication skills atrophied. I think for everyone, when you're becoming a young adult, when you're becoming, and progressing through your lifespan, communication is something that's really hard. It's not necessarily something that comes naturally. You have to work at it. But it seems now in an age of technology, people just assume maybe that they're bad at it and they shouldn't put effort into trying to improve the face-to-face side. And then they retreat more into, I'm going to order the beverage through the app, or I'm going to use technology in order to minimize the interaction that I have. And that goes back to what we were talking about with time displacement. And I know we're going to get into the research that talks about mental health and technology. But again, some of it could be not necessarily the content you're exposed to, but what you're not having, the kind of everyday interactions. Cost. Yeah, that we avoid, not just with the Starbucks app to order, but also having our phone in a public space and having that to look at instead of talking to one another.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, so I've used the term like, high fructose corn syrup surplus culture. We're until we had this massive resource surplus that, you can argue that it's utterly not sustainable and fine, fair enough. That's a separate conversation. But certainly right now, and certainly within the developed world, we've now had, since World War II, at least 3 generations that have known tremendous surplus. And prior to that, outside of aristocracy, in its various versions in other cultures, it was rare to find periods of time where strife and struggle weren't just normal. Mm-hmm. And that would then be our entire evolutionary past. I mean, I don't know how to credibly take anyone's version of human evolution that like there were, millennial periods, millennia long periods where ancient hominids or our ape ancestors just had it great. I mean, it's just not, it's always been rough until the modern West, and only now for a few generations. Mm-hmm. And so we evolved in environments where discomfort was the norm, and now we live in an area in an environment. We've literally created an environment. We're self-domesticated. We are zoo animals in a zoo of our own making, mm-hmm. and most of our cages are cultural constructs. And if you don't abide by that, we put you in physical cages, but I mean that is a framing it's a useful and generative framing as self-domesticated apes. But we are capable of keeping ourselves in incredible comfort, and we work really hard to make sure that we get rid of anything we don't like. Mm-hmm. And so we're at 72 degrees all the time, and so we try to we're air conditioned or heated everywhere we go. And we're now finding out, perhaps it looks like we're now finding out, that regular vasodilation and vasoconstriction that normally come from temperature changes up and down, that all of our ancestral lineage always had as an environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, mm-hmm. That's important to cardiovascular health. Mm. So being comfortable all the time in temperature might not be a good thing. Mm-hmm. But yet we have the means to be comfortable, so we do. And interpersonal interaction that might be anxiety producing. Mm-hmm. A interpersonal interaction with a stranger, for most people, always has a certain amount of friction, a mm-hmm. certain amount of anxiety, because there's a lot of uncertainty associated with it. Uncertainty mm-hmm. is anxiety. And we're developing all of these tools mm-hmm. that, among other things, are allowing us to stay comfortable interpersonally. Mm-hmm. And so we don't know what we're doing. I mean, so we wonder why everybody's anxious, everybody's medicated, nobody's resilient. Well, how hard have we allowed life to be?
Sure.
And all of this tech, whether that is the fact that you can get your coffee on an app and only have to sort of reach they even put it on a stick now sometimes, in the drive-through of the and how long really is it going to be before it's an automated robot arm?
Right.
They can do that now. It's just getting it widely available and making it less expensive. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
You're going to get your latte made, and you're going to pick it up, and you're never going to have a human there. And more things are going to be that way. And isn't that a vicious cycle? In that if interpersonal interactions with conspecifics that are not in your direct familial group, I mean, from sort of evolutionary terms, produce a certain amount of anxiety because they're of uncertainty, and it should, because you don't quite know who people are. If we get less and less of that, we're going to get worse and worse at it.
Yeah.
And it's going to then create more and more stress when we do interact, which is going to drive us to want to do it less and less.
Yeah. It is interesting, though. So one of my favorite studies, it came out of psychology, though it's very communication focused. I share it with my students, is focusing on how we are notoriously bad at predicting how certain things will make us feel when they're actually happening, or how we'll feel
that's insightful
afterward. And so they did a study, I don't know if it was in Chicago or New York City, but somewhere where people would have had an hour-long commute to get from their home station into the city to go to work. And typically what people do, even before we had the smartphones and like the big headphones to seal ourselves off from the rest of the world, might be sitting with a book, a newspaper, right? There's still this, you talked about social norms, that we sit in these spaces together but don't necessarily interact with one another. And often it might be seen as rude to be talking or trying to like strike up a conversation with someone sitting next to you, because people view it as kind of like alone or silent time. This is the table setting for the experiment that they did. They took folks, they divided them into an experimental and a control group. And the control group basically was told they were participating in an experiment, but they got on their train and they weren't really instructed to do anything at all. The experimental group was told that they were going to be...
This is an imaginary train?
No, this is a real train. They're getting on to
Get
go
on the train,
commute to
give
go
you no
in.
instructions.
Yeah. So they were just said, you're participating in an experiment. We want to measure how you're feeling now, and we're going to measure how you're feeling when you get to your destination in the city. Control group, we're not going to give you any directions to do anything differently. So most people got on the train and, listened to music or read books, etc. The typical behavior.
Right.
The experimental group, what they said was, here's what we're going to ask you to do. You're getting on the train. It's with a bunch of people you don't really know, as per usual. We're going to ask you to engage in conversation with the person sitting next to you for the duration of the commute, an hour from this station that you were departing from into the city. And we want to talk to you about how you think that's going to be. So we're going to measure your prediction of to what extent do you think you will enjoy talking to a stranger on the train for an hour as you go into the city. And everyone said what you said, what the typical prediction would be of that sounds awful. Yep. Usually I use this time to myself, I decompress, whatever the case may be. Uniformly, people predicted it would be awful. Folks who identified as introverts, because they measured level of introversion and extroversion, had particularly high levels of, I predict this will be awful and I will hate it. Mm-hmm. Extroverts were like, I think it will be unpleasant, but I can deal with it. They did this. They ran the experiment. They talked for an hour on the train, didn't give them instruction on what to talk about, but just said, this is what we're doing. They came into the city and then they measured for both groups, experimental and control, how are you feeling after the commute? And again, uniformly across the experimental group, people said that was actually kind of great. Yep. I feel better. I've had, human connection does something for us. It comes from evolution. There has been value in us being able to band together and live in communities. And so dopamine is released in our brain in conversation with other humans, though not so much dopamine when we have it mediated, right? So there's something about that face-to-face that our body just registers differently.
Right.
The people in the control group, not much had changed, and definitely lower levels of well-being reported afterwards. And so what's most interesting to me is the gap for the introverts was largest. The introverts thought it would be awful, and ended up being somewhat pleasantly
I believe it.
surprised by
Yeah.
the experience. And so I've replicated this study, not with full scientific controls, but in my classroom.
Didn't check the p-value, but
Right. Yeah. Where I say to students, I'm going to have you like walk across the room and sit next to someone you have not talked to in the class before. And like I use polling software. I'm like, tell me what you think it's going to be like. They go, they have the conversation. For undergraduates, I give them a little bit more support. And here's what you could talk about. And here's some potential follow-ups. And they report very similar things, that they actually enjoyed talking to that person, even though they thought it would be awful. So I bring this up because you mentioned that we might end up in a cycle where when they do interact with people, because they're anxious, it is an unpleasant experience. I don't know if that would necessarily be the case. So to me, encouraging people to continue doing that, even though they have anxiety, is very important.
Yeah, my point is, if you give people the option to opt out,
they often take it.
They're more likely to opt out.
Yes.
Because they think it's going to be less pleasant than
But there's plenty of stores that are removing their like self-checkout because customers are saying, I don't want to do that. I do like kind
and
of
all
miss
you need
the
is
human
one
element.
time of the thing doesn't actually work, and then you got to wait. And the human, and the other thing about the the interpersonal is there's a lot more dimensionality to that communication.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Zoom is what it is. The phone is what it is, and text are what they are, but they're all dramatic, dimensionally reduced information.
Zoom is very like disturbing to our brains, though. If you look at the research on this, and they're still trying to puzzle out some of the reasons why we are so tired after engaging in like a Zoom interaction for the same amount of time as we might engage face to face.
Okay, yeah. So just a little bit more background on that, perspective on that. And that's not just a ploy for me to finish my thought, because I'm actually super curious about that. People say body language, but there's a hell of a lot to body language. There's all the facial expression. There's tone, and but there's also what I'm doing with my hands and what I'm doing with my position and
proxemics, yeah.
And so much is in the context, and then that's nested in the further context of to what extent have we interacted before, and to what extent is this interaction related to other ways you've talked before, and the amount of communication, even though it's difficult to quantify and fully dimensionalize, but clearly based on the experience that you have and how much, say, uncertainty is reduced, how much. To me, it's not just I felt good about it because we like human interaction. A physical interaction enables far more communication than anything else, because we are taking in so much more information, and much of it is also implicit. I mean, it which is to say, our right hemisphere is processing it, and we'll tell a story about why we enjoyed that person's conversation or didn't. We still use a lot of left hemisphere to produce the train of words and all that other stuff. But when you dimensionally reduce that, I mean, you take it all the way down to a text message. Of course, everybody understands the ridiculous compression, right? And so, and the power of just one silly emoji because now you've basically gone to a dimension that's orthogonal, and because it's imagistic, it brings a whole nother layer to just, as opposed to just characters. But even a Zoom, so it doesn't. I mean, I view like a Zoom meeting or a video call as obviously it's a two-dimensional representation, and you don't have lots and lots of cues so that you can't be picking up on all that implicit communication. But that's fascinating that people are more tired. Is it the cognitive effort to try? Is it? Well, do they know? And is it the cognitive effort of attempting, because it's like I'm talking to you, but it's not. I mean, and as I go back and move forward and back, I'm not getting more. I've got no 3D. You're not cueing in to. We can't really resonate nearly as well. I mean, I'm a fairly autistic engineer. I don't resonate well, but I know what that is. But what are the tell me more about, like, what do we mean by exhausted, and how is that measured? And what are the competing frameworks? Try to explain maybe why.
So I think when people talk about Zoom fatigue, they're talking mostly about cognitive, sometimes emotional exhaustion. And it does have a lot to do with what you're describing about the energy that's required for interpretation and how much we as humans rely on proxemics, rely on gestures.
Proxemics. Is
Yeah.
that a communication term?
So, yeah.
I like it.
How much are we in proximity to each other,
Right.
what it means to lean forward, to lean back. Often, if you think about your typical Zoom meeting and the advice that I give to people as we talk about what we know from Zoom fatigue is like you want to move back further from the screen because we have a tendency to get it to be
Right.
like this, almost like a Brady Bunch type of series of faces. But then
Do
often,
your students know who the Brady Bunch is?
no, they would not. They don't even, when you make the Ferris Bueller jokes, they don't know those yet either.
Bueller.
Yeah.
Bueller.
There's a whole other conversation about how there's not even common jokes now because of media fragmentation, but that's fine.
Oh, yeah.
Going back to Zoom fatigue. Okay.
Yep, Zoom fatigue.
So gestures are not typically visible in a Zoom window. So one thing that you can do to add that back in and help to make sure you are understood better and to aid people in less Zoom fatigue is to move backwards so you can gesture and more of your body is in the frame. The inevitable lag, regardless of how fast your internet connection is, that's throwing off our brain as we're interpreting things. There's an element of, as you and I talk to each other, we're not doing a lot of direct eye contact the entire time. Humans tend to, as they're collecting their thoughts, look through other directions, and then at the end, look at the person that they're talking to. On Zoom, as we're all looking at our screen, which is where our camera tends to be, our brain registers almost as like hostility, a continued
or like
staring
10 people,
or looking
10
forward.
people are staring at me.
The same, yeah. So our
and they all have a resting bitch face and they look like they're annoyed.
yes.
What did I do?
That's not very, like our brain doesn't process that very well, even if we understand now that it's the norm. And the other element is most people have the self view up when they're doing a Zoom meeting, and that is also fatiguing for us because we're attending to how are we coming across, what do we look like? And so when you add all those elements together, you're going to be far more tired after an hour-long Zoom conversation than you would be sitting at a conference table with those same number of people.
That's fascinating, and it makes total sense. So what the hell did we do?
In terms of,
I mean, if you're stuck, I mean, I know there was a lot of I mean, when COVID happened, it seems like lots and lots of academics were like, we can't do what we were going to do. Well, COVID's happening. Can we study something related to the pandemic? So I assume that a lot of effort was done on the effect of remote work and the effect of remote education and its costs like this. So you said step back to let people. So perhaps
fill in more of the frame so your gestures are visible.
So by pan back so that your gestures are visible. Maybe avoid the self view.
Turn that self camera off.
Provided you've checked to make sure you're not wearing pajamas or something. But
in the background, I always talk to my students about checking to make sure that your background is something you would want people to see.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense. Oh, that would be very difficult.
Yeah. I think it's also challenging because some things that can help, like even turning your camera off or turning away from the screen and listening, are not seen as socially appropriate. If you if you're in an environment where kind of the expectation is everyone cameras on, then that's a hard strategy to implement. But I also think about teaching during the pandemic. I don't know if this was your experience, but I would say most students did not have their cameras on. Like they were engaging, they had turned that off. They didn't want to be seen.
So now we know another element as to why that might be. So, I mean, I teach online, but I mean, I also work in corporate America, and I went through the pandemic too, and even today, there's still, especially a large multinational organization, inevitably has lots of remote meetings, and now they're pretty standard, even with the get back to work kind of, get back in the office type thing.
Well, they're cost saving for sure to be able to bring people together and not have to have a physical space, or if you're bringing people together from different locations.
But what a thing I noticed that I now have a better understanding for it. I think I had it framed wrong, was there was a reticence to turn cameras on, and not only during the pandemic where everybody was remote, but even now when the majority of people are back in office and it's still a Teams meeting because not everybody's in that building, and some people are in another state or another country, whatever. But I had kind of thought, people don't want to be seen multitasking, or they or maybe they're slouching, or they don't want people to know they went around the corner to get a drink of water.
Sure.
But I noticed a couple dynamics, which was working level meetings, which is there's no manager present.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there might be somebody who's there to herd the cats or whatever, but I mean, you don't have a leadership element in the room. You don't have that sort of that hierarchical layer that inevitably changes the dynamics of talking apes. And it was at working level meetings I noticed, and I don't exactly have a giant sample set for this. And again, it would depend on the type of person and job, and a lot of my experiences with technical professionals, STEM field engineers. But anyway, noticed that it was common for people to just accept the protocol of, we don't turn our cameras on when it's just us people who would work for a living trying to figure out a project. And that when managers would come in, they would ask to have cameras to be put on. And when you would have like staff meetings, let's get everybody cameras on. And that was like, you're not being professional if you don't put a camera on. But if by putting the camera on, you actually are, it's more cognitively demanding. You're alarmed at all the faces, staring at you blankly. You're getting all of these miscues.
Sure.
That your ape brain is sitting there going, I'm not in a comfortable position here.
Mm-hmm.
These people are looking at me and they're not happy. And there's me. And do I look like that? And am I doing this?
But it also depends on the role that you're playing in the meeting. So if you are presenting something or trying to persuade people to do something, thinking about it from the perspective of like an instructor, or I did a whole summer of college orientations for incoming students where they were on Zoom, right? This was coming into fall semester of 2020. It's very hard on the person talking because we rely a lot on the nonverbals of our audience in order to see if we're being properly understood. Yeah, it just felt like I put a smiley face sticker next to my camera on my computer just to have something to look at as I was talking, because it felt like words were going out into the void. And so that's, as we still, like, we're trying to develop kind of norms of use and protocol. And I think it's interesting that you've highlighted this distinction between when it's a work meeting, then it might be more kind of like what a conference call used to be, right? There's no necessarily need to see one another, but there's often a sense that like when a boss or a manager is in the room, that you have to demonstrate that you're attentive, that you're working. You mentioned earlier platforms like Teams or Slack. And what I find super fascinating about the research in that area is that oftentimes the implementation of a system like that, particularly with an environment with a lot of remote work, there is a decrease in productivity around that time because there is more performative technology use going on of like, I'm very active on Slack or on Teams in order to demonstrate to you that I'm working, because you can't walk by my desk and see me doing that. You may see similar things with the culture of a manager in the Zoom meeting, and then kind of this idea of cameras on so everyone can show that they're paying attention and working. So I don't know if today we have like one solid answer of this is the best way to go about doing virtual meetings, because one thing that may be better for you if you are a participant who's just going to say a few things, but mostly you're listening to others talk, then probably camera off for you makes more sense, but that can make it harder for the people who are trying to herd the cats, as you said, or run the meeting, because they're not able to see you react or have the probably thousands of elements of nonverbal participation that we have when we're in face-to-face meetings. They're not able to see it. I think even with the camera on, you can't catch all of it. Like the sighs are not picked up when your microphone is muted.
That the challenges that we're talking about here, sort of the downsides of this technology, I think about online learning. And I spent a lot of time thinking and talking with educators about how to crack the nut on online learning in a way that, taking the classroom and turning it online sure doesn't seem like the future. The learning experience seems diminished. And yes, if you can't be on campus, if your option is I can't be on campus, or I I can be online or I can not get the education. Fine. But I've done a lot of thinking about how could we do this differently, and still leverage, online and let people learn remotely. And one of the things I keep coming back to is the cohort and so if I'm in a classroom, standard brick and mortar classroom, not my favorite environment, at least from a growing up standpoint. I've entered grad school 3 times and I've really liked the courses then, but that's grad school where it's like laser focused on something that you've chosen and you have affinities for.
Very different.
It's a different world than this sucks and I got to learn it. Yeah. But the energy, for lack of a better word, of a group of people that's your cohort, physically present, both for the educator who, to get a proper education, you're trying to get that that passion, you're trying to get that spark, you're trying to get that. You don't want an educator that is as bored as the students.
Right.
People regularly tell stories about, why they went into this field or that field. And often, this story comes to the person that, really, lit the spark in them because of the passion that they had for the topic.
Yeah.
And, I think about it I'm not saying that all classrooms, result in the spark, because there's plenty of teachers who just, pull all of the air out of a room. But I think of like a passionate teacher that loves the topic and loves teaching, and is adaptive in their minds around each individual student. And I think about all of the implicit communication available in a physical classroom with physical students. The energy that is bidirectionally exchanged, the information that's exchanged, the resonance of emotion, and the more higher dimensionality of understanding of what's actually being communicated. And when you're sitting there with your fellow students, you're 14-year-old boys and they're all throwing stuff and whatever. That's still a thing too.
Right.
But there's something to the being present as apes that totally change how we feel about the space. And when all of a sudden it's a bunch of two-dimensional, even whether their faces on Zoom or Teams, or it's no cameras on.
Are you talking about like synchronous online courses compared to synchronous face-to-face? Because when I think about online learning, I think a lot about asynchronous
Well, that's
courses.
but that's even worse, the asynchronous.
I think it depends though, because you talked about presence, right? And
Yeah.
we know
You're right.
that is studied and within my field is social presence and how we create it in online spaces.
Is asynchronous versus synchronous? Yeah. So I hope I'm not interrupting. I hope I'm setting this up.
I just want to
better.
make sure I know what you mean when you say online courses.
I just changed my mind of something I haven't really thought about.
Okay.
So I look at like synchronous online, which is to say everybody's on Zoom or whatever and it's live.
Okay.
Prior to this conversation, if you said which one would be more effective, I would say, well, synchronous would, because at least you're live. I understand there's lots of challenges associated with it, because if you have the benefit of online, but you don't have the benefit of temporal flexibility, a lot of people won't do that. Sure. And so I get why we don't have a lot of that. But now that I'm thinking about what you're saying, a asynchronous online where the instructor doesn't have to see the emptiness or the resting bitch face.
The blank cameras.
Yeah.
That's what you mean by emptiness. Okay.
Yep. The no cameras.
Yeah.
Or the dead faces.
Yeah.
And that the student doesn't have to suffer from the instructor basically having their soul sucked out of them by all these dead spaces.
I take exception to that. I was always very energetic,
I'm sure you were.
even though the cameras were
I'm sure
off.
you were. I actually, I believe that to be true, but I believe you're the exception.
Okay.
Versus an asynchronous where you can at least project yourself recording your lecture. You're not getting the negative feedback. It doesn't mean you're a great actor and you can emote and all that when nobody's listening.
Yeah.
But your probability of being more listenable than if you're confronted by people who
Sure.
Anyway,
I
so
think you also have to go toward shorter form when you're recording lectures for
okay,
distribution in an asynchronous course. And you're having to, I understand what you're saying about the loss of nonverbals. To me, when I teach online asynchronous, I need to do far more kind of micro assessment of how well people are following things because I don't have that shorthand of the, oh, this student looks confused.
right.
Or nobody answers when I ask, throw out a question to the room. And then I have them work in groups and talk to each other. And then maybe we're starting to get some answers. It's often you can get a sense of the level of understanding, not perfectly, because not everyone can talk at once. And that is an advantage, actually, of online learning that I can administer. Like, you can have a short form video and then you can ask a student 2 or 3 questions about the content and they can fill in what they understand or how they would respond before they move on to the next segment. Like that level of kind of personalization and the ability to get data on what they're understanding. And I can do that in the classroom, right, with polling technology. But it's still, I think there's a personalization that's possible in asynchronous online learning that is very challenging to do in a in-person class, even if I feel that magic of the energy and the co-presence.
Right.
I remember very distinctly coming back to NDSU in fall of 2020 when we returned. We were in person. We were high flex, right?
Yes.
So there were students joining through Zoom,
Yeah.
and there were students who were physically in the classroom. And that is the greatest teaching challenge I have ever faced in my life,
It's
because
still
I
going
felt
on.
sometimes like if I was reaching the Zoom students, that I was ignoring the people who were there face to face with me, and vice versa. But I still do think there is a lot of potential in online asynchronous learning as long as we are attentive to what we know about what helps to create social presence in online spaces, because there are extremely strong virtual communities where people who have never met one another, never even had maybe a phone call or a Zoom conversation, still have the sense of we're in this together.
So tell
These
me
are
more
people.
about this term, social presence.
Yeah, so social presence is the extent to which I view you as another real human interacting with me. And it's obviously something that now is a goal when we think about generative AI, especially the presence of it in customer service. How can we have things that seem human or seem sufficiently social to the humans on the other side that are interacting with them? If you've heard of the Turing test, right? The
Sure.
idea of when a computer
The thing we
could
used to think would tell us whether we've created artificial intelligence, and now we're like, oh yeah, of course it passed the Turing test, but that doesn't mean it's AGI. Yeah.
Yeah, but there are certain things that, and sometimes when you're trying to facilitate it within a classroom, right, you think about, well, are you going to have people share images of themselves? Like that's often something I do in an online class where I'm like, introduce yourself and share a recent photo you're comfortable sharing that shows you engaged in one of
Right.
your, so someone might have a picture of themselves cross-country skiing, for example. And that type of sharing out gives that sense of social presence.
That's
and it can create it
interesting.
through text as well, right? It doesn't have to be images. It doesn't have to be video. But through continued interaction, and I would say a good online class allows interaction between both the student and the professor and really facilitates interactions between students. You can come out of that with a stronger sense of cohort than you would sitting in my 60-person, 100-level course.
So yeah, that's that. And we didn't sit down to talk about online education. I know that you've had a lot of leadership experience outside of your role as a communications academic, and I really think we could do a full episode or more on this, and I want to.
But the general theme that you've talked about, and you talked about drawbacks or downsides, when I think about research or teach technology and social change, I talk about trade-offs.
Yep.
That there's always going to be things that we're gaining and things that we're trading off in order to have that gain.
There are no solutions, only trade-offs. Oh,
Yeah.
An amazing human being said that. Yep. I'm sorry, interrupted you.
No, it's fine. I just I feel as if sometimes I'm pushing back to say technology is wonderful, where I do have deep set concerns about how people are using technology. What you mentioned about political polarization in an online environment, that is obviously something that is affecting our lives outside of the screens. And it is something that's making it harder and harder for us to have productive conversations with people that we disagree with. I worry a lot about what like Jonathan Haidt has written about in terms of like online tribalism.
Oh, yeah.
That the fact that discourse in online spaces is public brings us to this space where we are trying to score points
Right.
against another team, and it's not so much designed to understand where the other person is coming from. But what's interesting to me, because I've done research in this area of political discourse online, and we've talked to people about like how do you approach that? Do you engage? Do you censor how you feel when you're talking about politics online? And we had there was like, I think 400 people in the survey that we did. And the majority position was people who were almost entirely silent.
Yeah.
Or if they were posting something, it would be only recognized by people who were in their political in-group. And what's troubling to me, knowing that the majority of folks were not participating at all, but were essentially lurking, is that usually those folks are the ones who are representing the more moderate position,
Right.
whether it would be within a liberal political ideology or a conservative one. And so the voices that are present tend to be the more extreme
Right.
ones, the folks who are trying to score points or dunk on the other team. And people still treat a social media feed as if it is a representative instance of public opinion on
Right.
the
Oh, yeah.
topic.
Yeah.
So if you're scrolling through Twitter, now X, right? Or if people are looking through their Facebook feed and they're registering posts that are about social issues, political topics, and they feel that these are the positions that are out there. This is what their community, whether it's like community in person or their social network,
We're normalizing
thinks.
the extremes because
Yeah.
of the way these things are structured and the way they reward combat.
Yeah. Well, we know
And-
that about Facebook. It prioritizes things that people are clicking the
Yeah.
angry
Oh, yeah.
reaction to.
Fear, anger,
Mm-hmm.
nothing spreads on social media like rage.
But that also decreases people's willingness to
Right.
participate in political
You went down
conversations because they
into
feel
the
like it's
basement
futile.
you thought we were going to have a discussion about politics, and you walked into Fight Club.
Right.
It's a blood sport, and you watch even even if you got a side, you watch your side basically get bludgeoned. Yeah, you're not going to speak. You're not going to speak up, and then so who speaks up are the ideologues. I suppose the psychopaths, the sadomasochists, whatever. But the people. There are definitely people who enjoy the combat, if you will. And then there are grifters and other people that are basically learning to monetize the conflict, and so that becomes who's trying to figure out our narratives. That's because and they're forming camps. And the algorithms are running at cross purposes to any attempt to mitigate that. In fact, the algorithms are feeding it. And so you said something, and this is definitely where I want to go, but I want to bring back a concept with it when we were talking about online learning, which is social presence. And I think about LinkedIn, and the LinkedIn's it's got its own share of like performative stuff because it's like hyper professional, and your coworkers are on there and your boss is on there and looking for work and all that other stuff. It's a unique place. It's certainly not a place for blood sport and politics, although some people seem to forget that. Where am I going with this? Anyway, it seems that like LinkedIn has it sort of norms within it of a certain amount of expected sort of polish and behavior, but it's also oddly niche and performative. I'm not trying to say that what LinkedIn does should be scaled, and regardless of what I might say here next, I don't want it to say that I believe that we should get away from anonymity online. In terms of like what Senator Warren, or I think it was Senator Warren, or was it? No, it wasn't. It was Nikki Haley talked about how we need to make sure we know who all these people are, something to that effect. Whatever. Forget the political names because it's political season. I don't engage in that. But there are plenty of people who think we should get rid of anonymity online, and I'm not one of those people. But I do think that the anonymity is part of the certain behaviors that are driving pathologies. and think about this concept of social presence, if I'm understanding it right, but also, how do you drive cohort effects that are, synergistic with in-group effects, and how do we drive interactions that aren't combat sport and are more along the lines of what Jonathan Haidt would argue for, and others would argue for, of people in. There are lots of places out there where people are trying to bring productive discourse back. It's just that the areas that are the people with the biggest microphones those microphones are attached to systems and algorithms where they make their money if there isn't productive discourse. If they make their money on things that are highly engaging, and we seem to like our combat sports.
Right. Well, the posts that have a lot of comments happening and happening in real time are the ones that end up getting featured, right? So there is an incentive for people to. It doesn't feel like discussions in which folks are truly searching for common ground end up going expanding into that 3,000 comment thread.
Right.
You're right. It does incentivize the sort of conflict and attempt to score points based on the audience. Because there's also, you mentioned liking, reacting, because that's part of it too. There are people who are not necessarily going to be posting, but they're conveying their political opinion through which one they're clicking like or love or favoriting. And it doesn't encourage people to engage in more thoughtful back and forth. I have a doctoral student right now who is investigating. She wants to talk to people who have engaged in disagreement with a close tie through Facebook. So like a family member, a friend, if they post something, it could be political, could be social issue related. We have a few in other categories, but if they responded publicly to something that they disagreed with and stated that they disagreed, how did they approach that, knowing that their comment was public, right? Could be seen by the audience. What prompted them to speak up, and then what happened with their relationship? And her study is qualitative, right? She's interested in sort of exploring in depth people's motivations and experiences. So we can't say this always happens. Right. But the majority outcome is that the relationship was very damaged, and that the disagreement
the Trump era ruined a lot of families.
Yeah, and a lot of people have talked about, I never knew my relatives felt this way or that way until social media existed. But what's interesting is that she's now expanded the study to look at people who have used a private channel to correspond with someone when they had they thought that they were sharing misinformation or they disagreed with what they were saying, that they, instead of putting the comment on Facebook, would have used Messenger to follow up. And those actually were better conversations.
Which makes sense.
Yes, but it also threatens this underlying idea that if we could all just share our point of view in social media publicly and do it respectfully, then maybe we would have this deliberative democracy online that early theorists believed that the internet was capable of bringing us. If you listen to Mark Zuckerberg testify before Congress when he's not turning around to apologize to people.
That was painful.
That is part of his vision, right? Yep. That if you can get enough people online and talking to one another, then we can have this global village. But a lot of the research is showing that we need to have more semi-public or even private one-on-one conversations with each other in order to make progress.
Yeah. How can the tech have more function and features, if you will, to make a more low friction as a toolkit of options. Have there be low friction options so that as a human, and I want to interact in various ways, and I want to have a conversation with you, but I actually don't want to have that conversation with everybody right now because I didn't know you thought that way. I hope I didn't upset you or whatever. Having easy, intuitive ways of doing that, just like we would in the physical world, would seem to be one at least reasonable step to mitigate that. Because one of the things with social media in particular, that seems why these problems arise is there's asymmetries in what aspects of human communication, human expression is it scaling, and what behaviors does it facilitate in that scaling, and which things just doesn't it scale, and that's the asymmetry. And it seems like social media is a gain circuit, a big amplifier, a big scaling factor for expression, and shaming. And the anonymity adds a whole nother element to the shaming part.
Right. And I would say it's not just anonymity, but also that decreased social presence.
For
so
sure.
you can have
Yes.
a medium where
The
you're known, your
detachment
name is
all the
there.
way to anonymity.
Yeah.
From yeah, I might be talking to a close relative, but I'll not really. I'm just writing a reply here.
Sure.
And I'm not experiencing all the things I might experience if I was about to say that to you.
Right. And
Like
you can
that's
see
the
the
dumbest thing I've
reaction.
ever heard. That's really dumb. Or don't you know that people are being murdered here and
Right.
we're having some argument about some
And this is
conflict
part
or
of why
whatever.
cyberbullying is often so much more vicious than bullying in person.
Right.
Not that I'm supportive of any type of bullying,
Sure.
but that not seeing how someone is
Right.
reacting directly
That's
to
the
your
asymmetry,
words. Yeah.
which is you don't get. I mean, it's like there's a book called On Killing, a famous book on studying the history of warfare and what it takes to get a soldier to kill another soldier, and how at least the thesis is in most wars when you're face to face, there's very little actual killing, and that the killing that would happen are two types. One is when the front of the other army folded and everybody is collapsing and retreating. That other circuits are predator circuits, chase circuits, and it's more easy for a human being to basically kill another human being in a war when they're running away, and so you get lots of deaths that way. But if we're going at each other with shields and swords or even muskets, but we can see each other,
Yeah.
that we were not actually thrusting all that hard or shooting all that accurately. And from exchanges of volleys back and forth where everybody's lining up and doing their muzzle loaders, the amount of people that were actually hit is so low compared if you took the same soldiers and had them shoot at a barn. But when there's a rout,
Yeah.
then there's a predator. But the other thing, which is relevant here, was those people that were running the grape shot cannons from a distance, which then in the modern context are those who are running the artillery and those that are bombing.
Right. Drones. Yeah.
Yep. Drones now, some drones, you can see who you're killing now. But I'm like a B-52 bomber or a B-29 bomber
Right.
World War II.
But it is a bit different to see it through a screen
Yeah.
versus
Oh, for
seeing
sure.
it face to face.
For sure. But there are some bombing runs where you're World War II, you're whatever 10,000 feet and
Sure.
more.
Very different.
But there's an anonymity. There's a lack of human. I don't want to say dehumanization. There's a lack of humanization of who it is you're literally killing. And so we know that all the way to killing people in war, that diminishment of that's not real, because you don't get that immediate feedback. Now it's this cognitive thing, or now it's this sort of future imagined abstracted thing. And so when you're saying something really crappy on a reply and it happens to be to a blood relative, you're not getting that interpersonal feedback. So that's the asymmetry
Right.
I'm talking about. That you can be our norm enforcement, whether that is don't do that or that shame on you or whatever, all the way to malicious trolling,
Right.
antagonistic, like out-group type behavior. Social media gives us this amplifier for all of that on top of without the mitigating circuit, without the thing that checks that, so that we don't engage in that unless you really have violated norms or you're truly an out-group member. So you get all this communication coming through, but it's really this conflict level energy that you would never have done in
Yeah.
person.
But I think there's another asymmetry in the amount of sort of consumption versus active participation that's going on, because I think that also affects how we feel after we use social media. In that we've been talking about people who are like posting, saying really like cruel things that they might not necessarily say in person. But even those folks are probably spending more time scrolling than they are commenting. And I think about the number of lurkers that were in our study
Right.
of political discourse. I think a lot about like
So does that create a negative effect? I mean, if you
well, I think, and that's one thing that I feel that communication adds and is helpful to the research that has come out of, say, psychology, sociology in relation to technology use and mental health. So there was a pretty famous meta-analysis that happened a few years ago. It's colloquially referred to as the potato study because researchers through the meta-analysis claimed that the effect of technology on people's sense of well-being, and here they were looking at mostly teens, that the effect of technology on teen well-being was roughly equivalent to the effect of eating potatoes as they were looking at effect size, magnitude. Because they
okay,
would, I
yeah,
don't know in what survey people would be
yeah,
reporting their potato intake and their
yeah, yeah,
technology
yeah,
use. But one of the things that is a big part of studying technology and studying social media and communication is the idea of it's not just like what platform it is, it's not the amount of time spent, it is specifically what you're doing while you are within that
right.
environment that is going to have the stronger correlation with your well-being. So the potato study or meta-analysis was lumping all sorts of things into technology use, not just time spent on social media, but also time, of a family movie night where you watch a movie together for 2.5 hours. Like that would be the same thing added in. So they say all technology use, that they're not finding a robust effect between diminished well-being and
Right. Which is
technology.
to say that, and that's actually one of my questions here is what do we know of, is any screen time the same as, if we say screen time is correlating with certain
I say the
negative
type of
outcomes,
screen time
right?
matters, and also the the
Consumption
element of
versus engagement,
co-viewing.
co-viewing. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
sure,
which is something
sure.
that doesn't, and I appreciate this because a couple of years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics updated their screen time guidelines to move away from the model where we just say like this many hours beyond which you should start worrying about your child to focusing on like what is the quality of content that they're consuming. Can we increase the amount of co-viewing that we do with our children? And honestly, that's pretty challenging for modern parents who, and I know this, often
Yeah.
like rely on the iPad in order to
Yes.
get things done. But it's a stronger understanding that the way in which we're using the technology and what we're doing with it is going to have a much stronger association with potential like immediate effects and possibly even long-term effects than just time spent on it.
So let's talk. This is, I mean, we definitely wanted to go here. This feels like a good time to, in not just mental health, but what do we know, and what are we still trying to figure out in terms of negative outcomes for things,
Yeah.
including, I mean, we have the term isn't satisfactory to me because it seems like it doesn't give you any where to go with the term, but a mental health crisis, seems to be growing,
Absolutely.
and that the graphs on ages and just, a clinical diagnosis, or if you look at a graph based upon medicated, or a graph based on even to some extent, I assume institutionalization, but I don't know, but certainly a graph on self-report, and you look at it over the past 30 years, and then you put that, do you, how often do you feel anxious? How often do you feel depressed, or have you been diagnosed with being clinically depressed? Are you on an SSRI or whatever? It shouldn't. I mean, everybody that's tuned into stuff wouldn't be surprised to find out that has been steadily increasing, but that when you break that into age cohorts, it's really, really alarming.
Yes. I think particularly when you look at
And gender.
yeah, the statistics that look at people who get to the extent of engaging in self-harm,
Right.
making like a plan in regard to suicide,
Yeah.
attempting suicide, dying by suicide, that at younger and younger ages in the time span, and usually when you look at those graphs, it's kind of like 2012, 13, up to present day accelerating.
Right, and that's a
particularly
part
for
of
younger
Jonathan
people.
Haidt and others have if I remember right, have talked about that
Right. He
particular
has a
year.
book coming out called The Anxious Generation.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And so like Jean Twenge, who writes on generations and sort of changes that have occurred over time, she also points to the fact that when we look at it in time series, that the increase, like in either the self-reports of experiencing, and she breaks it down in terms of symptoms of like not enjoying everyday activities, feeling like you don't have value, kind of classic symptoms associated with depression, that those start rising very quickly around the time that smartphones became kind of more widespread in terms of both parents having them and then eventually teens having them, and also the point at which time spent on social media outweighed by number time spent interacting with friends in person. And she also talks about kind of counter arguments that exist. And I talk about these with my students because my students will tell me that their generation is justifiably anxious because the world is so terrible
Yeah,
right
that's a
now.
construal,
And
but yeah.
she looks at some of that data and looks at different time series, like for instance around World War II, when the idea of like if you were in this particular age cohort, you might be going off to war that actually like young adult mental health was pretty high at that point, that we don't see whether that's kind of an extreme example, but even things that have happened
But
over time
nobody
since
likes
then.
nobody likes feeling of pervasive anxiety
Right.
without a construal, and they will fight hard to find the construal
Mm-hmm.
to the point of the amount of energy some people find to come up the story of why they feel
Right.
anxious. It's ridiculous in some
Mm-hmm.
cases where, because we want the linear narrative, we want the causal factor, and
Right.
hey, we feel like shit.
Right.
So why is it that I feel like shit? Well, how could I not feel like shit? Because, global warming is going to come in, or this is going to happen, or Trump's going to get elected, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Those always strike me as, okay, you fixated on a construal right now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's probably not why you're anxious.
Right.
Might be you're anxious because you basically almost have no interpersonal meaningful connections with
Right.
human beings anymore. Maybe you're anxious because you don't have any meaningful connections with nature anymore. Maybe you're anxious because you don't even know what the sacred is, let alone having a meaningful connection to something that
Mm-hmm.
feels sacred or something that gives you awe.
Right.
Something that feels beyond words, something that qualifies as a transcendent that you can just like look at and experience, even
Mm-hmm.
like really good art, not art you rip apart and
Sure.
and deconstruct. If you don't have those things, you're going to feel anxious because
Mm-hmm.
you don't know who you are, you don't know why you're here, and you don't know where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else you do to tell yourself why you feel that way
Mm-hmm.
is an attempt at some sort of salve. It's some
Right.
sort of it is a construal, which is to say a story we tell ourselves afterwards.
Right.
Um,
And I
but
think that there's other elements going on in terms of we talked
ranted there,
about
sorry.
time displacement, right? So one of the big things that's getting displaced with social media use is sleep. And we
Oh,
know that
for
when you're
sure.
not getting enough sleep, that's not conducive to good mental health. And even if you are really diligent about turning the phone off at a particular time, having used it up until bedtime, like you can get 8 hours of sleep, but it may not be high quality sleep because, as we've talked about, the content on social media is kind of designed to activate certain parts of your brain that remain fairly active and have a harder time kind of calming down and allowing you to go into a more settled form of sleep that's going to be higher quality and help with both your physical and your mental health. And so I also want to go back to the fact that for most people, the majority of social media use is consuming content, and in some proportion, either like posting content or interacting with content. Because we know one of the things that prompts not so great feelings for humans can lead to anxiety is social comparison.
Oh, sure.
And prior to social media, the big thing that I remember being in college and taking a critical media course, and the big thing that we talked about was like airbrushing, right?
Oh,
Of
yeah.
models or people in
Yeah,
magazines
well, that's
that
airbrush.
like,
And before
that
even you'd say that's
that it
Photoshop.
that it wasn't like a realistic
Right,
portrait.
right.
And now we live in an age of like our friends thinking about, the typical middle school or high school girl looking at images of friends that are also, first we had the Instagram filter that made you look better, quote
Yep.
unquote, than you
Yep.
might in
Yep.
everyday life.
Yep.
And now we have the normalization of using photo editing apps to do things like changing the width of your nose, changing the color of your skin. And so you have these images that you're surrounded by constantly of both people you don't know. So we have all these like celebrity influencers that you're constantly seeing them, and people you do know in their best possible. We already had. And I think oftentimes we don't think about the fact that one perfect picture that we see of someone that we know, and maybe, for people who are older, we might look at like, oh, someone's perfect family photos and how
Right.
like tranquil and happy they all
That's
look.
not at all like my family.
And this idea that it took like 400 shots to get that
I
perfect one
just
that was shared.
posted, my wife and I were just in Naples for a thing. Technically, it wasn't vacation. I posted a picture of the two of us for the 10 minutes we got to the beach at Naples. And it's an adorable picture.
Right. And
I
that's
got,
why you posted
I got
it.
like 80 people that so far, 80
Right.
people like, yeah, that's amazing. And love and all that, the hearts and everything else.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And it is, there's 12 other pictures that look like shit.
Right.
You know,
And that wasn't like the thing you were doing the whole vacation.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
right. We
and we're
don't share the
curated.
moments of
But
stress
we
or
do
when
that
we
to make
argued. Yeah.
ourselves, we want to present ourselves in the best sort of possible way.
Right.
And there's network effects, and I mean, we're hierarchical apes, and we're status conscious, we're appearance conscious, and we're more and more that way. We're all a bunch of self-curated personal brands.
Right.
And so we feel better when we do that. And every time we do that, we make other people feel worse because of the social comparison.
Right.
And it's like when you look back at pictures of people in high school in the 80s, and it's so obvious that almost none of those people know what they look like on camera. That even when
they don't know their best side.
They don't know their best side. They don't know. I mean, none of that's curated, and now
Right.
most people are hyper aware of that,
Right.
and the generational effects are super pronounced. That the younger you are, the more aware of it that you are. And then you throw in that the 50% of humans are on the bottom half of looks. Otherwise, you don't have a distribution.
Right.
So half the people are unattractive, if you want to say just are you attractive or unattractive. But I mean, but the actual way that those things, if you ask people those things subjectively, it's not typically a 50-50. Although it's closer to a 50-50 when men rate women, and it's like 80-20 when women rate men. Oh yeah, that's well documented in terms of appearance of the cost of making the wrong choice. For the one that carries the babies a lot more.
So then these apps are shifting that everyone is appearing more attractive?
I don't know. I'm just saying that people are hype. We're now way more aware of where we fit on like an aesthetic scale.
Sure. And I think that's part of why, and one of the causal mechanisms pointed to as to why sometimes people feel really crummy after consuming a lot of social media, that social comparison is not typically a positive experience for us. And when we are comparing, like my students will say what they always heard in high school was don't compare your insides to someone else's outside, because you just never know what's happening in their life. But as you said, we tend to, on social media, share the best shots. Some people are even editing those further to make them better. And you and I are sitting here having a conversation about the recognition that happens. But when we look at our phones and we go like, we scroll and we scroll and we scroll, we're not having that same thought of like, oh, I wonder how the rest of that photo shoot went. Or does that person actually look like that? Like we don't, we
and
just
when
continue
a celebrity
to
posts their makeup free spot,
right.
It's like, you look gorgeous without makeup.
Yes.
That hurts even more.
Yeah.
So.
And so I think it's not just physical, because you talked about norms. And so there's a lot out there, and this is more in the popular press, written about kind of like Instagram face. And there is research showing that as especially young women's social media and passive social media consumption increases, that their acceptance of plastic surgery or like actual physical alterations goes up. So we're seeing like an increase in use of lip fillers, a lot of like like Botox before you have any fine lines. My students were telling me something about 10-year-olds at Sephora who are out trying to get the anti-aging serum. And so that's just the physical look side, right? That you could end up feeling bad about how you think that you look after you've gone through this edited, curated social media space. But there's also this sense of everyone is out there having fun without me.
Right.
That is often operating because, again, people are, even if they're sharing like casual things, it's, we're together with these people, or the thing that you mentioned in the professional setting of, I was so lucky to be part of this panel. And so someone else may sit there and see it and go, oh, well, why aren't I being invited onto panels? Or why am I at home looking at this while other people are out having... And so it's this edited version of everyone else's life. Of course, we're not going to feel super great because we have access to all of our life, right? All of our interiority. I think that what you're talking about of people who have a strong sense of personal value, people who have something transcendent. I've actually noticed within my classes that my students who have a fairly strong religious affiliation and identity, that they are often the best at conceptualizing kind of intentional technology use, because they
Yeah.
recognize how the world that exists on social media and how that makes them feel is very different
Yeah.
than who they would want to be based on their religious tradition.
Well, people without religion will find it. And you can't, I'm going to spout off here, but you can't not have a religion. Those circuits need to be filled.
Right.
You can't you can't get out of bed without a value framework.
Right.
You can't, I mean, literally, like if you value life and you value, the comfort of not having to urinate,
Right.
whatever. You can't go out of bed without some value frame, and you can't make decisions about the future
Right.
without contextualizing why do you care or where are you trying to go. And then if you keep down asking yourselves these questions, I mean, you start to get into deep, meaningful questions of what's the whole point.
Sure.
And then if you don't have an answer for that, you'll find something, because you'll be absolutely you'll be bereft and lost and unmoored. And what you might find is to shorten your time scale, to literally rewire your prefrontal cortex to care more about now and now and now,
Right.
which is sort of a hedonistic kind of short-term view, which is not satisfying. Or you have some sort of version of that that could be classified as nihilism, or you are in such existential terror, literally, because you don't know who you are, why you're here, and all that other stuff, that you opt out. And that opt out isn't just, self-harm is itself at least a form of communication. But women attempt suicide more often than men, but men succeed, because men usually, when they decide to use highly violent means, and are less likely to use it as a form of communication once they reach that sort of decision. But it isn't just suicide; it's the sort of slow suicide of addiction, which is I have to medicate to not feel the utter pointlessness of it all. So yeah, we're covering a lot of ground here, but I think that.
But I also feel for some people that like social media and scrolling is a form of kind of that medicating without necessarily like alcohol or
Well,
drugs,
it's the time.
right?
It is. You could put that potentially in the bucket of the shortening of the time scale, and you're basically you basically find yourself an analgesic balm, your soma, of the dopamine drip, of intermittent reward of interesting stimuli,
Sure.
of weird construction mishaps in the third world, which is what that's what scrolled for me this morning, and like, oh, that's something I've never seen before, and you put comical music to it or whatever, and then all of a sudden there's a man riding a crocodile, and the next thing you know, 2 hours have gone by.
The time disappears.
So yeah, and whether it's, but that's that to some extent. People who study these things will have much better jargon for this, but to some extent you can bucketize that with hedonism. I mean, it is still just I need stimuli,
Right.
that takes my attending away from the pointlessness of existence,
Right.
because I don't have any framework, and it doesn't seem like social media gives us that. It seems like social media is, it is its own soma, but it also, so far in its evolution, we've seemed to have used it more to further tear apart and form our own unique narratives than coming together. And it seems like it's pathologized a lot of behaviors, because that asymmetry, but and it's a moving target, and we're just figuring this out, and we will figure it out. And I might sound all doom and gloom. I'm very optimistic on the long term. I just worry we're going to go through 2 generations of hell to get there.
Yeah. Well,
And
I mean,
we don't, and maybe we don't have to.
I think about folks who were like teenagers in I don't know. We use aughts to describe like 2000 to 2010. What term
We're
are we
still
using?
working on
So
that.
we're still
Yeah,
working on
aughts.
that.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Yep.
people who were
Born in
teenagers,
the aughts or
2010
whatever.
to
Yep.
220, and would be like adults, right? Working adults at this point. That generation was almost like guinea pigs of a sort, in that we didn't have like a strong understanding of what the impact of giving them unfettered access to smartphones,
Yep.
to social media. Talking to my students, most of them got their first smartphone around fifth or sixth grade.
Right.
They're at a very kind of delicate developmental
And
stage,
at the
right?
same time, we decided that all expression is good expression, and all sexual expression is good expression, and putting that down is its own form of bigotry. And so we did not know what to do with access to pornography, because it kind of got stuck, it got attached to that.
Sure.
And so here we are with every child. If you just give them a smartphone, has everything under the sun,
Right.
Rule 34, and other stuff. And it isn't just that. It's even if all they're doing is engaging in Snapchat. But I mean, you're right. The guinea. I'm old enough to where I was a free range kid running around on the bike, and I'm old enough. I saw a good comedian bit on mindfulness, and he was talking about what are you talking about mindfulness? We didn't when I grew up. We were always stuck alone, and we were always alone with our thoughts, and, and we always had to wait for stuff.
Right.
And now nobody can even wait a second without having to have something on their phone, and so now we have to be intentional about mindfulness.
Right. We
'cause
need our phones to tell us to stop and take a moment to breathe.
We need the mindfulness app
Yeah.
to have Sam Harris telling you, okay, now just attend to the sound of my voice.
I mean, we've talked about that kind of influence between, and I would say it's a reciprocal influence between culture and media use. And I think something that was happening at the same time as we have kids who are being given phones, being given smartphones, being given access to social media, because at this point we didn't really understand what some of these developmental implications might be. It's happening at the same time that parents are feeling like it's not safe for kids to be outside and be free range. Or
sure.
even if you were a parent that believed that, you were likely to be socially shamed for allowing your kid to walk a certain
Your
distance from
6-year-old
school
was
to
on
home.
a bike outside.
Right. And so
I called the cops.
And so there was this, I think, and I think about this as well from the perspective of being a parent, of if you're kind of afraid of what's going to happen to your kid if they're just off,
Right.
With their friends, biking up and down the streets or hanging out in the woods, that if they're going to be at home and they're going to be on their phone, that you feel almost like they're safer because they're contained
and we're hyper
physically.
aware of that. And media tells us the one worst story that happened to 1 in a million people, but it feels proximate.
Exactly. Yeah. And so then it's also feeding that idea that the kids are going to stay at home and they're going to do a lot of their socializing through online spaces. And sometimes we worry about content that they're encountering.
And you're regulating
that they're
your
not
own
ready for.
anxiety as a parent.
Right.
Because you don't know how to handle we don't know how to handle anxiety. We feel that we must do something. I'm worried about my kid. So the action that we're taking and rationalizing the iPhone.
And it's also hard.
Is assuaging our own anxiety.
Yeah, it's hard with culture because there's a number of kind of prominent thinkers on like media and society now that are really advocating for 16 as the age at which you allow children to have a smartphone or to go on social media, and making statements that like a generation from now, people will think we were just very misguided to allow kids as young as 10 to be on.
Lots of things 100 years from now where they go, you know that they in 2020.
But it's interesting because that right now is my personal plan for my family, and I have a lot of conversations with my kids about like the things that I teach in regard to social media and some of the things that I view as like the trade-offs, right, that you have going on. I am always somewhat amused and maybe a little bit like sharing the ambition of parents who have a social media challenge. It's like, if you can stay off social media until you're 19, you'll get this amount like toward a car, toward college or whatever. So my son is like, yeah, I want to do that. So you can pay me this amount of money to stay off of it. But when I tell my students this, that the plan right now is to wait until they are 16 for them to have a smartphone or to have access to their own social media account, my students have told me that I am damaging
Oh,
them
that you
irreparably
can
when it
certainly
comes
make that
to
argument.
social ties.
They're
That they will not be part of the culture at their school
Yes.
if they are not on social
They
media,
won't know
if
the
they do
meme.
not have
They won't know the
smartphones.
memes. You know, they won't have the implicit understanding of whatever is
It's
the next
happening
tic
right
tac.
now. Like I walk them to school and they're second and third graders who have smartphones. And
Yep.
there is all sorts of content that is learned from TikTok and brought into the elementary school lunchroom that my kids do not necessarily
Yep.
know the reference, or they're learning it through peers. But I think that's always been true with media. You can never completely wall children
Right,
off from what is out there in
Right.
culture because they're going to get it through various
Yeah,
avenues.
it's yeah, we don't know what the hell we're doing.
Yeah, but I don't believe in the Pandora's box argument of like it's here.
Yep.
We can't do anything
Right.
about it, so we might as well just let children
It
use
seems
it.
like your approach, if the option is just let them, it is what it is, or let's keep it away from them at least until they're at some level of teenage maturity, and that's contextual by the kid.
For sure. I know that based only on my N of 2, but yes.
Yeah. I mean, that resonates with me. The part I wish we could find, which I believe is one of the biggest problems, is the erosion of resilience. And so, I mean, we raised our kids, right or wrong, from a perspective of attempting to make them as resilient as possible in terms of exposure. So we and again, right or wrong, because I don't have the access to the multiverse to see how the other me's worked
Sure.
out with the different decisions.
Always hard to know.
In terms of just sort of letting them be exposed to the full spectrum of American media content that a kid can access, and that included, not restricting the movies they would watch and that sort of thing. If they wanted to watch it, and typically with violent content and that sort of thing, so hey, we can watch it even though it's rated R. And I did my best to try to attempt to contextualize the information to try to make them resilient. I have no idea if that was the right approach. I mean, and again, my N equals 3 is not enough by which to
Sure.
get a paper on. But resilience itself, as a term, it's a useful term, and it seems like, when we talk about anxiety, we talk about depression, we talk about self-harm, we talk about all the various negative things that are happening and increasingly happening. This notion of resilience seems like a good construct to shoot for and to try to understand. It seems better than like the concept of, remember the term grit.
Right.
We just need grit. I still don't understand exactly how grit is different than generally speaking conscientiousness. But resilience feels like a thing that we can understand and shoot for, and that part and parcel to resilience is exposure at some level.
Yeah. And I think that my students' strongest counter argument to what I've told them my plan and approach is the question of, well, how will you teach them to navigate it if suddenly they're like allowed to do it and before they couldn't? Where is the scaffolding? Where is the building up? And I, as someone who studies media, even before social media, this idea of co-view, what you're describing, right? That it's probably better to have some exposure to content that is a little beyond where you are right now and someone to talk about that with, or to have the opportunity to navigate an online space and to encourage conversation about it. And so that's something that I have to think through, right? I've got a few years right now. I have a kid who's going into middle school next year, and I think that this is going to become even more prominent than it is now when he's in 5th grade. But that question of how can you help someone develop the resiliency to social comparison, for instance, as we've talked about earlier. How can you
status? Yeah.
Yeah. How
Who
can you
you
get
are.
someone to think about how the impact of what they're posting on others or the online actions that they're engaging in? I think that is all very valid and very important. And I don't know if I for sure have an answer to it right now. I just think that there's not a compelling reason to just give my child a phone because all the other 5th graders have one. And I'm fortunate in that he is at this point in agreement with me because we've had enough conversations about things that he is doing and focusing on instead of having a smartphone. But
Yeah,
it
I
may
think
change, right?
and I don't, and I'm not, I'm not sitting here pretending that your decision is right or wrong.
And I think it's like you said, it's possible that I will never know because you don't see the counterfactuals.
But I look at resilience broader than that, and not so much. And when I say exposure, I don't mean therefore we should expose even the youngest kids. I mean that I come back to Jonathan Haidt and coddling, and to me the best way that I've seen to try to view this is dichotomistically. That also seems to cut across with gender reasonably is care versus harm. Because we all want to take care and we all want to prevent harm. And very broadly speaking, the desire to care for a person in the moment is, generally speaking, I'm going to just say it stronger with women on average. And the desire to prevent harm down the road is more likely a male parent's point of view of I'll make you strong for later kind of thing. And it's certainly wrapped up in that approach is certainly wrapped up in our traditional view of the roles.
Right.
But setting aside, and there's a great, I guess I'm not setting aside. There's a great evolutionary argument for why that would be. But irregardless, I don't think that's a word. Regardless of the gender preferences on care versus harm, this notion of care and harm as a trade space that we don't balance well, and that we've overemphasized care, and we've overemphasized. I need to keep you happy and safe now, and any little discomfort you have right now is a thing I need to attend to.
Right.
And I, as a parent, also attend to myself that way because I can't take it when you're not happy as a kid. You're my little Horcrux running around in there.
Never heard that.
That's my soul out. It's my soul out there running around in the world. You've been Horcruxed every time you have a kid, and when your kid is being bullied at school, or when your kid is finding out that nobody likes them in their second grade class, and you see the pain, that's your pain.
You feel it, yeah.
And when you're trying to make your kid feel good now, you're trying to take care, you're also doing that same thing. You're really trying to take away that anxiety you're feeling.
Right.
But it seems like as a society we've skewed the temporal part of it, the now part of it, and we've lost resilience as a culture, as parents, and now we're inculcating that into our kids and making it worse, because that's all they know is that every little discomfort is supposed to be taken care of, and you're never supposed to feel anything difficult. Right.
It doesn't help that we're living in a culture of very intensive parenting that also is very amplified through social media.
And the harm part, the future part, the harm that will come from not having resilience, which is to say you can't deal with your own anxiety. And if you can't deal with your own anxiety, that's one of the best anxiety generators that exist.
Sure.
Because it's a loop. Anxiety is uncertainty. And I don't know what's going to happen next at some level. That's what anxiety's for. It's to bring conscious attention to something in your world is not that clear. And if you can't process that, some of it is lack of future focus, but if you can't understand that and figure out a way to bring the little bit more certainty of, okay, well, here's what I'm going to do, and I'm a little more confident about that, or I don't know what might happen next, but let's focus on the opportunity, or whatever the thing you're doing mentally to try to change how your view of the future is to deal with the anxiety. We're always trying to manage our anxiety. But if we don't get good at handling the new, and so one of the things, I'm not saying this very well, but one of the things for dealing with anxiety, the anxiety that comes from uncertainty, and when you're in a social comparison situation and you feel bad about it, you might feel anxious. That's because of what might happen in the future now that you know or you believe you're low status or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's still a future-oriented thing, but I'm getting pedantic here. One of the things that really helps for dealing with anxiety that makes you more resilient is a history that you have lived being able to overcome difficult things. Mm-hmm. And if you're coddled from literally when you're born, mm-hmm. Here's a bunch of super soft foods, and we come to you every time you whimper, and we take care of everything along the way. And then when you get into elementary school and things don't go well, I'm helicoptering around to talk to your teacher and to talk to other people to make sure.
Or bulldozing to get the obstacles out of the way.
Yes. And don't let you bloody your nose. Don't mm-hmm. let you free range run around. Don't let you deal with the consequences of your actions. Mm-hmm. You lack that self-narrative in your own history that tells you that you're strong, mm-hmm. and that you can overcome things. Because if you've never overcome things, you're not going to have any confidence to overcome things.
Sure.
And that's kind of the place we are. And I view it as is misunderstanding the trade space between care and harm. Mm-hmm. And I believe it feels like a deep ongoing debate we're having that we can't articulate. Mm-hmm. And that framing to me is the one of the framings and it's not anything I made up. I've heard it before. Mm-hmm. Don't claim it. But if we could look at social media in that regard, at how we use media, mm-hmm.
if I can ask, how would you connect that to the question of when are children ready to have social media accounts, to have unfettered access to a smartphone? What I'm trying to understand is, would my attempt to delay that be more under the, so this is a strong caring instinct. I want to prevent all the stuff that I know, the harms that I'm aware of, researchers are aware of, Meta is aware of, yet still trying to market strongly to young girls, which is very problematic to me.
Yeah, we know this. Our product causes all these problems, but it makes us so much money.
Right. So my question is the delay that I would like to see in my family, that evidence of I want to keep you from being harmed by social media?
You're asking my opinion, and I'll give it with the recognition that I have no idea whether I'm right.
I'm just an academic who wants to make sure I'm applying the framework correctly.
So what I was talking about is broader in its context.
Okay.
From a care versus harm, which to me is a time scale. What time scale are you focusing on? Mm-hmm. Well, how much of the future are you living in?
Right.
And are you living in a realistic future where you've actually thought about the ramifications of things? And the most important thing is understanding what you can't consistently predict, mm-hmm. the complexity of stuff. So we've got a lot of unknowns here. We're not sure, but I want in 10 years, I want in 20 years for these things to happen. And I have to think about the harm I might be doing by putting too much care right now. I don't think that what I would advocate, for whatever it's worth, is that be a thing that is inculcated into all of your decisions as a parent. Mm-hmm. And when I say try to raise kids with resilience, and I don't mean deliberately expose them, to a thing that would be very challenging,
right.
But just in every way you look at it, when you're trying to decide whether to intervene or not, or to allow something or not, mm-hmm. Is to see the care harm trade space
right.
as the frame, and sometimes care is, there are definitely moments where very now the mm-hmm. most important thing is you get that kid out of the way of that car.
Right.
And the situation calls for a
mm-hmm.
particular time, and there's certain time scales where the uniqueness of the situation is drop everything and attend.
Right. But I would also argue that a child or young adolescent gains more opportunities to try things, to fail, to have that experience or experiences that build resiliency in offline spaces, sometimes in online spaces. But as we think about the time displacement, I feel like If I,
Yes.
for instance, said to my 11-year-old, I have decided you can have however much screen time you want to have. Here's the iPad. Like, I've seen people do like this experiment as parents to be like, well, maybe they'll get sick of it. I feel like if I were to give him unfettered
Know
access,
that Bo Burnham song?
no,
Welcome to the Internet. Mommy let you use your iPad. You were only 2, and it did all the
right.
things we designed it to do. Now look at you.
I feel like he would spend 4 to 5 hours a day on the iPad
Yep.
if that was the norm, or if it wasn't something that necessarily we were either monitoring or like making sure to fill his life with
Right.
other. And I understand that that's also intensive parenting, right? These activities. But I think from a time displacement
Intensive parenting.
perspective,
Yep.
to have things where you're really encouraging face-to-face interaction between
Right.
your child and
Face-to-face
their peers.
interaction of unstructured play,
Right.
where there's a non-existential risk involved.
Yes, to go out and to do something like taekwondo or a piano
Yep.
recital where you can get up and you can totally, like, you can lose that tournament, right?
Yep.
You can play the song perfectly before you got up in front of a bunch of people, and then it doesn't go very
but
well.
there might be something. There's probably a scale factor here too, which is if you want to learn Taekwondo, and you're, I don't know, 8, it's probably better for your resilience, for your self-narrative, that your struggles involve learning Taekwondo and trying to be better or trying to keep up with other 8-year-olds in your little town.
Okay.
And if you want to learn chess and you're 8, I would imagine learning how to play chess with other 8-year-olds in your town is a good place to start. But if where you start is online against people that are rated like 1,500, that's pretty devastating.
Right.
You know?
You want the zone of proximal development
Yes,
happening. Yeah.
zone of proximal development, and where it's an interesting. I think that's seems like a good way to view it in terms of exposure of your children to these online environments. Is what are the competitive landscapes where there might be a status angle, and what are the predatory landscapes? And then what are the ways in which it could be pathologized? And are you going up against the best of the best trolls, fully weaponized and other things? And you as the noob coming into some chat space or whatever, I'm dating myself by even saying it that way, could probably end up getting a very negative experience that might be quite harmful. So what is the incremental exposure by which one learns strength and learns that they are themselves strong and resilient by overcoming things. So the challenge has to be, and obviously there is literature in this area, and there's lots and lots of people who have opined philosophically, and I'm not going to do a good job framing it with my words here, but the learning that you are capable and strong has to come there's that sweet spot of it can't be too easy, and we know it. We have to feel the strife, and it's just like, it's like accountability and autonomy for people in a job environment, and I imagine it would apply to school. But in a job environment, if you have good autonomy and accountability, which is to say you have the freedom to make your own decisions, and you have to live with the consequences of your decisions. If that has balance, you know whether something was hard or not, and you know whether you accomplished something big or not. And all the trophies of the world aren't better than your own personal assessment of how much growth you did. And in fact, if you get a trophy, a promotion, an accolade from something that was easy, there's a dissonance to that.
Right.
And if you don't get one for something you know is hard, there's plenty of dissonance to that, but you know what you were able to do.
Yeah, I grew up in the era of participation trophies, so I know what you mean.
And those were really dumb. And it's not like, and you can't, and that was I grew up in the self-esteem movement, which has also been largely debunked. That you just tell people that I feel good about myself. I'm a good person. I'm great. No, we know if we were hackable that way, how useless we would be. We'd long ago been eaten by hyenas by going, I'm good.
Right. But I think in terms of timescale, like we've talked about the impossibility of recognizing or knowing for sure what will happen from either as adults, our use of social media technology, or thinking about kids and adolescents, but I think that there is also something to be said for stopping and either reflecting on it if it's one's personal use or if it's how technology impacts people in relationships. That's not something we've talked about necessarily, how technology can make you feel very close to someone you don't get to see very often, and that's a wonderful benefit of it. But it can make the person who's sitting next to you on the couch feel ignored.
For sure.
And so taking a moment to say, well, we don't know for sure what 10 years from now, like this amount of TikTok use would do, but we can take a moment to say, like, how do I feel after I do this? How do I feel after I do that? Or let's talk to each other about how the technology use is like impacting our relationship in good ways or our family dynamic in good ways, and what are sources of conflict that surround technology use. And I think sometimes there's not enough of that. We have a lot of social conversations about the impact of technology. I don't know how often we're engaging in conversations with people that we are close to. Maybe it happens more commonly between parents and children, but those seem to be conversations more along the lines of, these are the rules and I'm the parent and I have decided it is that way. We don't do as much kind of co-negotiation of technology rules or establishment of norms or talking about it directly, because we tend to adopt technology that others are using. There's always a social network effect. And I think that having those conversations, even if we don't know the eventual outcome, can help us to recognize ways in which it is either beneficial or harmful, to try to mitigate some of those harms and maximize the benefits. And it's hard to do that on our own because technology use, as you said at the beginning, is going on. Like, my technology use has all these vectors of kind of impact to other people. But there are people in my life that I could talk to. And my kids are actually super great at calling me out of when I'm on my phone. We had a family mantra very early where it was like, people are more important than screens. And so they will say that back to me if I am, I'm in the room, I got my email open, I'm distracted by something that's come through work, but I'm at home, right? I should be in a different headspace. I will have a kid come up to me and say, like, Mama, remember, people are more important than screens, because they feel like they are not being paid attention to.
So maybe we can attempt to mine what we've talked about now for take-home value.
Yeah.
And one of the things, like the way you were saying that, like the idea that an interpersonal interaction, like this interaction, was more generative, more efficient and functional, more pleasant, will have a lot more lasting impact on me neuroplastic-wise in terms of what I remember of this, because it was face-to-face versus if we were Zooming. And it seems to me that we know this just simply by the reflection on it. Like, just by, we don't spend our time thinking about it. Like, but once you think about it, like, yeah. So, like co-viewing.
Right.
I'm looking at my screen, and we're sitting down. You're a teenage kid or whatever, and I'm looking at my screen, or you're looking at their screen, and all of a sudden, like, my son will do this, and it'll go like this, and it'll be a meme that I'll resonate with, and he shares that with me.
Right.
That is that's a connecting interpersonal event.
Absolutely.
That social media and memes enabled. But when he's on his phone and he's giggling at a meme that I don't see, that's actually kind of worse than if he didn't giggle.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because he's proximate.
You're feeling that you're missing the sharing. You want to be part of it.
Physically in the space. So that's one cue. But then what he's communicating to me bodily through his interactions is he's completely somewhere else and enjoying that somewhere else. It seems that reflection and intentionality are two things that are coming out of this conversation. By reflection, I mean, we don't need a magic translation guide or a bunch of studies to know how we feel. And to know that when we have an interpersonal interaction, that it's richer, and that isn't just an argument for happiness, and feel good and all that. I mean, it's richer. I mean, there's more information transferred. It has more value. It has more meaning. You can jump from it in many more ways. The connections that are made interpersonally are more valuable, stronger, and have more utility from a network effect and other things.
I would say as long as people feel they can be authentic with the person that they're interacting with.
All the other, yes, for 100%. But we know that by simply reflecting on it and reflecting on an experience that we had, and the great example of the going into an experience where you have to interact with strangers and our predictions, because we're challenging with uncertainty. All you need is one really crappy interaction, or a threatening interaction,
Right.
To make us have a certain amount of, I don't really know, this could go anywhere.
Yeah,
This
we have a
person
mental
could be
image of strangers.
Yep, and we
does
might
not
have an
encourage
experience or
conversation.
two in our lifetime. So that's always a thing. But we need to reflect, and we need to realize that about us, and then we need to be intentional. Whether it's okay, I'm going to intentionally do something that's a personal interaction here because I know that that's richer. I'm going to intentionally limit this social media thing because it's just a bunch of scrolling right now, and it comes at an opportunity cost that could involve something richer. And again, by richer, I don't just mean it was more pleasant experience. I mean it gives you more for your life.
Right.
So what other things did we pull out of this? I think
We talked about the difference between passive and active use. So communication scholars who are looking at kind of well-being and communication practices would say that passive scrolling is one of the worst things that you can do when it comes to how you're feeling after using social media, because it, as we talked about, you suddenly, with social comparison, have access to a whole universe of folks that you didn't have before. Like humans have always been really good at comparing ourselves to our neighbors, but suddenly we have like millions of neighbors who are editing their experience.
The asymmetries and say, well, let's just say the sort of lie of online social comparison is it's not, you will process it as a social comparison as though you're sitting around with your conspecifics around the campfire.
And as if that is a representative slice
As if
of
that is the
life.
representative, and not a very carefully curated
Exactly.
slice.
And you just have it over and over and over and over from a whole bunch of other people. And even though we know if we step back and thought about it, that everyone is engaging in the same type of curation at that moment, we don't necessarily. And I think also we talked about how we often go to social media when we're bored or when we're feeling low, that it is something that kind of like the variable reward, the dopamine drip that we expect to make us feel better. But if you go into that space already feeling not so great about your life or what's going on, then that social comparison, that detrimental effect is going to be amplified. So what's valuable to me in the research is that we know that you can use social media in ways that do boost your mental health and well-being. And those have to do with being a more active user.
So tell the listeners here.
What do you want to be doing?
What is a passive user versus an active
A passive user is someone who opens TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and reads and goes through. And you might like open a post, read the comment threads, but you're not participating in the conversation. I would say that in some instances, even like the liking function, if it is someone that you don't know, that you're just adding to like, oh, I want to convey that I like this.
Oh, that feels, I don't do that a lot.
Right.
But every once in a while I'll see something on Twitter. I follow a lot of like obscure neuroscience and other stuff. And somebody I've never heard of before shares an interesting article or an insight. That clicking of the heart button.
Right. But you're not doing it. You're not doing it because you want that poster to know that you feel that way about their. You don't have a relationship with the poster, right? So if I have a very small and intentionally curated Instagram feed, right? So the people who I follow are people that I actually know. And when like a friend from college posts a picture of like her daughter doing something and I like it, I'm attempting to convey something to her. But I also know from the research what I should be doing is I should put a comment. Like I should use that as a point of interaction and relationship maintenance rather than just continuing to scroll through or kind of reflexively liking content.
Passive consumption.
Right. It's just reading, scrolling, looking, watching
assuming
videos.
You're watching the algorithmic stimuli, dopamine,
And the
intermittent stuff as
platforms
opposed to,
are building themselves out in ways that continue to encourage
for
that
sure.
that pass. If you think about stories, you don't even have to scroll anymore, right? It's just going to keep bringing the
Yep.
content up to you so
Anything
that
to
you can
trap the
continue to do
eyeballs to
that.
give you ads.
Yeah. And so if we know that that typically does not result in us feeling great, some thinkers have described it almost as social snacking, that we take it as an approximation of human contact or knowing what's going on with like the community or people around us, but it doesn't have the same effect for our personal well-being
Okay.
as having a genuine interaction with someone
Makes
else,
perfect sense.
which might be more like a meal, right? And some of it is like those interactions can be more difficult. And often the food that is good for us and makes our body feel good isn't the tastiest.
Right. And that gets to that care and harm thing too, right? For ourselves, the avoiding, don't do something just because it's comfortable, and recognize that. It isn't to me just the dopamine drip, which some people will know that the intermittent reward is the most potent thing for driving the need to keep doing it. But there's also a thing with some of the passive consumption that it's cognitive ease, which is to say that the brain takes up about 25% of the calories we burn, and it can be a lot more than that. Two world champions playing chess are literally sweating, but just like at default, it's like a quarter of our calories are going just to maintain whatever the default mode network is, and it's like 8% for a chimpanzee. So we have a lot of these things that are resource-based. You start jogging, you're going to get tired. You're going to get tired long before you ever get injured, for the most part, if you're healthy, because it's your body saying, hey, you're using calories.
Right.
Yeah, sure, you want to do this? And if the cheetah's chasing you, I do.
And that's also part of why we spend so much time scrolling relative to active participation on social media, because it's a lower energy activity.
Because it's lower energy activity, because you
Yes.
are not burning that many calories.
Right.
You are not cognitively engaged.
Yeah. But we know that actually participating, like using it as a forum to communicate, though, I think that we probably don't have a strong sense from the research of if people are using it to like spout political vitriol. I don't know that they're necessarily feeling better.
That was where I wanted to go on the engagement, is it seems like some kind of positive functional engagement.
Right.
And maybe if it's discourse, tune into how you feel afterwards. And if you get into combat with somebody on likes, did you move a needle somewhere?
Right.
Really? Did you make things better by saying raw for our team? Tune into that. So,
and I think as a general rule of thumb, if you can operate with, does this form of engagement or communication enable me to strengthen a tie with someone? And that doesn't mean that everybody on social media has to be my best friend. Right. But even like weak ties are incredibly valuable to us. We know this, right? And social media is something that enables us to maintain a wide array of weak ties. And so focusing our energy on supporting those relationships and thinking about how is social media impacting the strong ties that we have, whether that's how we are together interpersonally, like is the phone getting in the way of the relationship that I have with this friend, with my partner, with my children? Are there ways in which through social media I can maintain a close tie with a friend? I am someone who lives very far from both sets. My mom does not live here in Fargo. My husband's parents live across the ocean. And so social media is something that allows them to see the various things that their grandchildren are doing, right? But that is social media use put toward the function of maintaining a relationship. And it goes into like they can ask about that when they're having a FaceTime call on Sundays. And so I use that as a general metric of like, am I using social media in a healthy way? How much am I like interacting, and how much of those interactions are going towards supporting relationships in some form?
Right. And so the algorithms are trained for, they're looking for engagement, to boost engagement. But if generally speaking, engagement is better than passive consumption, for all other things being equal, then the next take home thing is the type of engagement, and look, and what's positive engagement.
Right.
Look for ways in which you are within your existing in-group, your close ties, your strong ties. Are you doing things in your engagement that's reinforcing or strengthening those ties, maintaining because it isn't just you; it's the people you're also engaging with that you're helping. But a life worth living is a life connected.
Yeah.
And health outcomes are directly tied to how well people are connected. I mean, some people live longer just because they got a cat to take care of. I
Sure.
mean,
Yeah.
so we know these things.
Yeah.
And so, are you engaging in a manner that's if you're engaging with people that are, say, a close-in group, are you strengthening and maintaining those ties? Otherwise, are you engaging with weak ties in a way that could be productive from a network effect?
Sure.
Whether that's in a way that might help you because you're making better connections, or are you actually in some way helping them? Yeah, and even if you're engaging in discourse and you don't agree with somebody, are you doing it in a productive way?
Sure.
And I don't mean that everything has to be compliments, and I see what you mean, but I mean, are you just screaming your points, or are you actually doing something that you feel that some other passive, because huge swath are the lurkers that you say, right? And if they're seeing those comments, are you just feeding the polarization, or are you steel manning? So
yeah.
Weak tie engagement, is it productive? And
Yes.
do you feel good about it? Not in a combat dominance sort of way.
Are you contributing something positively to the overall ecosystem?
That's the broader thing, which is being and the intentionality and awareness of these things, that you are in the media game.
Yeah. And so one thing that I would add to this, and I know that we're in the process of wrapping up, but there is one exception to kind of passive consumption that is still associated typically with well-being, and it's looking back through one's own timeline of the photos you've posted to Instagram, videos you've created. I personally, one of my favorite features in social media is the kind of time hop function of like 10 years ago, this is what you were posting about. And to go back to what you were saying about resilience is I think in some ways, like some of it is nostalgia, right? Some of it is like, oh, my kids when they were little, so cute, that just gives you the warm fuzzies when you look at it. But also some of it is if you are sharing like an experience on social media, that realization of where you were and who you were at that time and how far you've come from it. Can be beneficial.
Absolutely.
For you.
And I mean, nostalgia is viewed a couple different ways. And my view on nostalgia is it's twofold. One is in terms of what is it about nostalgia? What is it about that movie that Netflix show Stranger Things, if you're, my age, nostalgia for the 80s. But to some extent, it is a check back at where you were if you get nostalgic,
right?
Which is to say the positive feelings of associating with past events or things or culturally things that are associated with the past. You're reconnecting to a time in which you felt you were on a good path, if it feels good. There's plenty of people that have bad associations with times, but and so that gives you perspective because everything's a prediction moving forward, trying to decide what to do next. Reconnecting with your past in a way that's like, oh, yes, I remember why I wanted to do that. I remember why that was important. Those are nice iterative sort of checks on, am I leading the life I want to lead?
Yeah. But it's also, I mean, I think I would offer it with a caveat of it can be bittersweet too, that you can be like, oh, my life is not like that anymore.
But that's its value because it's that iterative reprocessing. Because sometimes you discover, I used to have such dreams, and now I've been in this cubicle for 10 years. Yeah. And so the value of nostalgia is one of them is looking back to look forward. And it serves as an iterative check on the decisions you've made recently. And it's just a big, long loop that now media enables too, that we're doing all the time anyway. It's just and when we feel nostalgic, something is calling to us about in our self-narrative that says, this is part of who you are that isn't seem to be part of who you are now. Sometimes that's not thing you can do about when you're looking at when your kids were little and you're a grandparent.
Right.
But some of it is a thing that informs you to move forward. And the other side of it is exactly what you were saying, which is it becomes part of the self-narrative of your development. And from a resilience standpoint and knowing how strong you are and what you're capable of, being able to go back to times, and even it's just Facebook saying, 10 years ago, you were here.
Right.
And you think of yourself and you think of what, maybe you weren't very confident, maybe you were in a new job, maybe you were a new parent.
Or something was happening, you were convinced the world was ending.
Absolutely.
And you got through it.
And you got through it. And anything that we can tap into that feeds resilience, don't be afraid of those. So I like that. That's also a great take home. So enjoy the timelines, view them from a resilience and from a
Mm-hmm.
check standpoint on you still feel good about your life path. Leverage the value that you have this running curation of who you were, at least imagistically, in maybe some comments, because previous generations didn't have that. They're
Mm-hmm.
scrapbooks,
Mm-hmm.
and they'd spent a lot of time making them, and they were themselves highly self-curated, that you could never quite catch that odd moment
Sure.
that you completely forgot about. So okay, so we have timeline. We have remember the importance of co-viewing and
Mm-hmm.
sharing in terms of positive things.
Active engagement in social media, prioritizing relationships and sort of relationship development. And I think also that aspect of talking to other people about technology use, which is usually impacting just more than the individual. So whether that's like how technology is supporting a relationship that you have with a friend, a partner, or if they feel like the phone is getting in the way. There's really interesting research showing that even a phone on the table keeps people from engaging in self-disclosure. And I think that not
Sure.
just having these conversations with people, like being open to someone saying, I really feel bad when you're on your phone at this particular moment, or like when we're watching a movie together, I wish you would just watch the movie with me instead
Yeah.
of checking your phone every few minutes. But one takeaway that I think is really important is that those conversations should happen like repeatedly. It's not a one and done type of thing, because it's very easy to fall back into somewhat automatic or
Sure.
reflexive technology use. If like I'm someone who studies and teaches about technology, social change, and the importance of being intentional about it, and I still fall back into it because the lure of technology is very powerful. And so recognizing that reflection and conversations with others should happen repeatedly and with an openness to change, to recognize that there's a lot of structural factors that are operating against your ability to act as an individual agent. Like give ourselves a little grace, but also realize that we are capable of making changes.
Our takeaways for this, you know, be intentional.
Mm-hmm.
Be reflective and actually use your own. Whether an experience was positive or not.
Mm-hmm.
I'll throw in, think about that whole care harm trade off thing too. A big thing, it was opportunity cost,
Mm-hmm.
right? Know what the time you're spending on this tech is coming at a cost of what you could be doing otherwise
Mm-hmm.
in the wild, so to speak. Yeah, think about strengthening your ties, both weak and strong, and think active use, positive, productive active use,
Mm-hmm.
and try to minimize passive use. See the value of co-viewing and sharing of content. Indulge in your timeline from a self-narrative, from a resilience standpoint, and recognize just the interpersonal opportunity for some aspects of engagement, and the interpersonal cost for other aspects of engagement. Anything you'd want to add to that, or any other lessons from communications, or anything else to close us out?
Sure. So the one thing that I would add is the importance of personal values, which we touched on in this conversation. I think sometimes the concept of being intentional with technology use, we understand that as don't be just automatically picking up your phone and using it, but pick it up because you have a reason to do so. I think that trying to make decisions about like, is this a time to use technology or not? Often, if you have a strong sense of your personal values, that's going to help you make that call, because you have a better sense then of, does this support the value? If I talk about like being present with my children as a value that I have, that's going to inform the way that I approach using technology. People talk about like a phone foyer, having it somewhere else in the house so you're not tempted to pick it up. Knowing that I have that personal value is going to help me know why I'm off the phone, right? And it often can put in place activities that are helping me live the value rather than just picking up the phone and using it reflexively. So I talk a lot with my students. I talk a lot with my children about what are things that are important to you. Is the technology and the way you're using it serving that importance, or is it getting in the way? And sometimes it's hard to know. That's why I say conversations with others can have a lot of value. But using that as a metric of what's the benefit, what's the drawback, and where am I at in this trade-off equation is often going to provide some of the answers that we don't have when we just pick it up automatically.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. So just remember, whether you like it or not, you're in the media game. So be informed about that, know what that means, be responsible with that obligation, and use it to make the world a better place, not a worse place. And the opportunity is there, and it's on us. Thank you. This was awesome. I learned a lot, and I hope everybody else did. Hope to talk again about education and other things.
Yeah, online learning.
Yeah, online learning and pedagogy and factoring in technology as well. So,
yes, technology will always give us something to talk about.
Carrie Ann Platt, thank you.
Thank you.
This is only the beginning.